thing is, I do believe there was talk about these things. I believe if we study history, you know, the Confederates were able to shoot pterodactyls, you know, back in the Civil War, and they spread these things out. Anybody can look it up online.
Google it
They
yourself.
spread these things out, and this is a historical fact. So, you know, they spread this thing out, and it's got a huge wingway. It was a pterodactyl they shot. So, of course, these things have been around. Now, they went extinct, obviously, slowly, but surely. And so...
What I'm saying is Jesus wrote a dinosaur to work. That's history. It's in the Bible. How to Train Your Dragon.
Historical facts.
And if you don't believe it, do your own research. Pull up Google. You'll find the picture, I promise.
Oh my God.
Thank you, John Gleason, Godless engineer, for gifting me this beautiful moment. Y'all remember when they tried to cancel Steven Spielberg for posing with an animatronic triceratops animal rights activist?
Back it up.
Hit it from the back.
Cloaca. Historical facts.
Eat my ass, BP. You're down here bailing on the rest of us because you don't want to process your grief and shame like a normal person by drinking and mistreating strangers.
No, Rick. It is you who must nibble my cloaca, or bird asshole.
Everyone knows what a cloaca is.
you know, back in the Civil War, and they spread these things out. Anybody can look it up online. They spread these things out, and this is a historical fact. So, you know, they spread this thing out, and it's got a huge wingway. It was a pterodactyl they shot. So, of course, these things have been around. Now, they went extinct, obviously, slowly, but surely. And so...
Paul Bunyan was sharing some Funyuns with his pet velociraptor.
Whoa.
Oh, you thought it was an ox? Roll back the clock. Let me knock the socks off. Historical facts.
I didn't cut out. You heard me. You a pervert or something? Okay.
What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be covering PragerU's video defending Columbus Day and basically taking a very racist shit on Native Americans, indigenous peoples. So we've got that coming up. We're not going to be having a normal stream today, so you'll have to excuse me for that. I'm just trying to, refute this video that I've been meaning to refute for 7 years. So, if you want to fuck around and see Steven Crowder get his ass handed to him because he's parroting a whole bunch of racist bullshit for PragerU, then please stay tuned. All right, heathens. Well, I just want to draw your attention to the chat over here, which apparently my camera is a little bit fucky. I want to draw your attention to the chat here. I have set a super chat goal because, this is how I'm making money now. A super chat goal of 10 $5 or more super chats. And if we make our goal, then I will directly go into reviewing and refuting a Dan McClellan anti-mythicist video. He's done a number of them here lately. So if you want to see me refute them, refute one of his videos today on this stream, then consider sending a super chat and I will directly go into yet another review if y'all end up liking that. I do have the option on for this whole community leaderboard thing. The more you chat, the more you super chat, the higher you'll be in the list there of the top fans. First up is Clever. He's at the top right there. Then there's the Kentucky Atheist and JL Warren. They are at the top right now. We'll check in on them here in a little bit later to see who is at the top. So if you want to shout out, send in, chats, super chats, and all that kind of good stuff, and you will be able to get up there at the top. So we're gonna head right on into the review, and normally I have my Stream Deck set up here to automatically go to like the different views and whatnot, but for whatever reason it's not exactly operating today. I'm not sure why that is, but let's go on ahead and get into the video review. Okay. I am streaming vertically and horizontally. I'm trying this out. I'm not exactly liking the vertical. I don't know how it comes across like on a phone, but it's having like, because I use the full width of it and I have a different setup for vertical streaming that I do for, the actual video. It's not exactly translating all that well. It's having a tough time finding me right now. Huh? I selected, there's this new layout option that says horizontal and vertical. It says choose if you want the stream in horizontal or both horizontal and vertical layouts to offer more ways for the audience to view your content. And so like if you're on the phone, I'm guessing if you're on your phone, it automatically pulls up as vertical maybe. No? I don't know. It's just something that I turned on and I'm learning how to do it right now. But in any case, I'm not sure how to get that to operate, I guess. Maybe this is something that's really new and it's having trouble getting that going down. Okay, anyways, so let's go on ahead and get to PragerU. Now, I do have notes pulled up that where I've been researching all the bullshit like in this PragerU video. He's got a lot of incorrect information that's being presented in those videos. So let's see. Get my notes here set up. That is working. Okay. All right, Steven Crowder, let's go. What do you got to say for PragerU and Columbus Day? I do want to note that I don't refer to it as Columbus Day, even though federally it's recognized as Columbus Day. I prefer, Indigenous Peoples Day. It definitely reflects on the impact that colonization has had on Indigenous peoples of the Americas, both North and South Americas, and the Caribbean, which is primarily what is going to be discussed with Columbus, although Steven Crowder is going to bring up other indigenous peoples and other instances of genocide and atrocities committed against indigenous populations by colonizing Europeans. And so I prefer Indigenous Peoples Day because it reflects on a better it reflects on how indigenous peoples have been mistreated rather. And so, yeah, that's why I prefer that. But Columbus was a total shithead. I know exactly why Columbus became celebrated, which we'll get into here in a minute, which has nothing to do with like the founding of America or anything like that. It actually has something to do with racism. But we're going to get into that here in a second. So let's go ahead and get started with Steven Crowder. If y'all don't know Steven Crowder, after the whole Charlie Kirk thing, he started up his whole change my mind, shtick again. He's, got a bulletproof vest on and everything like that, which considering that Charlie Kirk got, shot somewhere that the bulletproof vest is not going to protect him from, I'm not exactly sure. I feel like it was more performative than anything. But in any case, Steven Crowder started that back up, and so he's trying to fill that gap in the stage there. And you'll notice in this video he employs a lot of the same tactics that Charlie Kirk does, meaning that he has a shitty position, but he tries to shield it by admitting at least something was bad or wrong, but then he goes on to justify that it happened. And you'll notice that in this video. hopefully everybody can hear me. Yeah, everybody should be able to hear me, and hopefully they can hear the video source. Let's see. I cannot hear the video source. Hold on.
Thanksgiving.
Oh, okay. That's because there was no sound. Fuck me.
Thanksgiving, Independence Day, Memorial Day. Holidays are a great time to riddle Americans with needless oppressive guilt. But the one that stands head and shoulders above the rest is Columbus Day. The day where progressives indoctrinate your children into believing Columbus to be Satan incarnate, the USA to be his evil spawn, and the Native Americans to be pacifists.
No, I totally disagree with that characterization of how we would teach Columbus now. I mean, obviously in the past when they've taught the legend or the mythos of Christopher Columbus and everything like that, like he sailed the ocean blue something in 1492. Obviously that was very mythical. That was the lore of Christopher Columbus that actually reaches back pretty far. And that lore that we all were taught in school actually played into why it became a federalized holiday. And so no, nobody is teaching Christopher Columbus like that. I mean, we understand that as mythos now, and it should be something that, we like, if you're going to teach, kids something, you should teach the full breadth of it. So like, yes, Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and landed in the Caribbean. He thought it was India, and that's why he called them Indians and all this other stuff. Or they eventually became known as Indians as opposed to indigenous people and Native Americans. You could teach all of that, but then you can also add the caveat that he was a rather shitty person who was eventually stripped of all of his titles because he enslaved people that there were specific laws against in Spain enslaving those people, because the government, the kingdom or whatnot, kings and queens, or I think it was queen, they considered all of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean to be Spanish citizens, and you could not enslave them at that point. Although we'll find out here in a minute that there were specific reasons for enslaving some of them. It's just that it was found out that Christopher Columbus actually enslaved people that he shouldn't have enslaved. So it's still not the best, portrayal of it. But the way that Stephen Crowder is framing this is obviously dishonest. It's not accurate to portray the education of children, even now, even 7 years ago, as this kind of portrayal here. We all understand that, yes, there were some atrocities even committed by indigenous people in their warfare. We understand all of that. So, claiming that progressives, leftist liberals, whoever you want to say, is teaching kids these things, to portray them as like saying, oh, Columbus is bad, America bad. I mean, America, like the founding of America and everything like that, is so far removed from Christopher Columbus, as well as the conquistadors and all of that kind of stuff. The founding of America is so far removed from that. I mean, obviously, we've got the Manifest Destiny that pushed us all the way out to California and everything like that. So that came later and is somewhat relevant. But as far as Columbus Day goes, it's not really all that relevant in this particular context.
And so now we have Indigenous Peoples Day, or as it would have been named 30 years ago, Aboriginals Day, or as it would have been named 10 or 15 years ago, Native Americans Day, or as it could be named tomorrow in Canada, First Nation Peoples Day. Feeling the urge to self-inflict grievous bodily harm yet?
So obviously this is just rhetoric that's meant to, it's just rhetoric to emotionally trigger you, right? And he's being a bit facetious here, obviously. I do want to note that his shirt has the Try the Walther on it, and this was 7 years ago. I would really love to hear an explanation from a conservative out there as to why they're portrayed as being the violent group, as opposed to, the leftists and progressives and liberals out there that aren't walking around with fucking carrying weapons on their shirts, dual wielding it, akimbo and everything like that. And, as well as the other shirts out there that are the exact same way. I really don't understand why conservatives don't understand that they are putting off this this whole persona of being the violent gun enthusiasts. Like, they are doing that, and this was 7 years ago, and they're doing it then, and they're doing it now. So, like, I don't understand why the conservatives are confused. But in any case, I got off on that and I totally forgot. Oh yes, the naming of it. So just to give you a little bit of history here as far as the naming of Indigenous Peoples Day, and what's the history behind that? It actually has a lengthy history. Let's see. I got to get to my notes on this. So Indigenous Peoples Day was first formally proposed in 1977 at the United Nations Conference and adopted locally in Berkeley, California in 1992 as a direct counter to Columbus Day. So the name Indigenous Peoples Day has actually been in use since 1977 because that's when it was proposed at the United Nations. It's just that it took, 15 years? Yeah, sorry, I had to do quick math, and I'm tired. I've been working all day, surprisingly. But it took like 15 years in order for it to get acceptance to the point where an actual city adopted it. Native Americans Day is observed in some states, notably South Dakota, which replaced Columbus Day with this name in 1990, making it the earliest statewide change. And then the term Aboriginals Day is not used in U.S. observances. It is more common in Canada, which celebrates National Indigenous Peoples Day in June and previously referred to Aboriginal Day. So I don't understand where he's getting Aboriginals Day as far as like here in the United States, or even Columbus Day, because we're focusing on Columbus Day here as a celebration. And I mean, with PragerU marketing itself to, primarily United States audiences, I guess also Canadian audiences, but it seems kind of like a left field kind of thing to bring up Aboriginals Day. And then First Nation Peoples Day is also a Canadian term. So if we're going to be talking about Columbus Day and people celebrating it and what's taught in schools and everything, maybe we should stick to, like actual Columbus Day type things, because those things don't seem to be relevant to that. But maybe I'm just too American centric in that particular respect. But what Stephen Crowder's trying to do with this is he's trying to build this sense of like, well, leftists and liberals and progressives, they don't know what to call this day. They just know they hate Columbus. And I mean, it's okay to not like Columbus Day, not like venerating a fucking Christian slaver who essentially started the Atlantic slave trade. Not liking the celebration of that particular historical figure is perfectly fine. And with it being a decentralized effort to change and craft some kind of day, some kind of observance for the indigenous peoples, I mean, I would expect there to be a lot of names, but it's not like we're scrambling to figure out how to erase Columbus from our history. We can acknowledge Columbus and his horrible actions, as well as what he did to, colonize this area. Not that colonization is good or anything like that, but I mean, we can be, we can not like celebrating it and also have a wide variety of terms in order to replace that day. But it seems like Crowder is using this as an emotional plea that liberals and progressive leftists, they're all just being way too emotional about it because they just emotionally hate Columbus, and that's just not the most accurate way to tell this.
Inflict grievous bodily harm yet? That's only natural because the whole charade has become an exercise in hating Western civilization, which is really just an exercise in hating yourself.
No, it's not about hating Western civilization. I mean, you can hate our past while still progressing forward in our future. I don't understand why this has to turn into some kind of self-hating thing, other than the fact that he's still playing at this whole emotional argument, this argument from emotion, which is a fallacy. I mean, he's trying to build up this whole idea that, oh, leftists just want you to hate yourself, and that's so like early 2010s for a conservative to say, which, I mean, 7 years ago, it's 2018, right? So, I mean, I guess I can understand, that's still kind of late in the whole self-hating kind of rhetoric that we were seeing online. But Steven Crowder's definitely trying to portray leftists as this self-hating group. But it's not about self-hate. It's about recognizing how shitty our past has been and how shitty it was for the Europeans to colonize America and destroy native populations. But we can also continue and progress in our society now. Like, one does not affect the other. We definitely need to accept the horrible truths about our past so that we're not doomed to repeat them in the future.
First, as far as Columbus goes, the guy deserves some credit, right? Flawed, to be sure, but he was the greatest navigator of his age, the first person to cross the Atlantic from the continent of Europe, and he did so without any maps and only 3 small ships.
There are multiple things wrong with that particular segment, as I'm sure that most people can recognize. So hold on, let me pull up my my other fact checking sheet here. Okay, so obviously this is false. The Vikings that were led by Leif Erikson, they reached North America around 1000 AD, and nearly 500 years before Columbus. And we definitely knew this before Steven Crowder made his fucking video here. Whoever made the script, they're just totally behind on it. They're definitely wanting to portray the mythology of Christopher Columbus as opposed to like the real story of Christopher Columbus, or the real history of Christopher Columbus. Personally, I prefer true history as opposed to the mythology of it. And I can understand some people preferring mythology to the true history because of maybe the message or something like that. But I don't see the benefit in that, because I feel like you can definitely teach those aspects that you're wanting to teach without having to stoop to like misrepresentations and lies. Maybe not lies that you are telling, like you maybe you completely believe in the lie, which would make it not a lie coming from you, but somebody had to lie to you. Somebody had to first lie about it in order to have that come up. Just want to say a quick hi to everybody in the chat. Oh. Okay. Lies My Teacher Told Me by James W. Lowen. Apparently has some is a great reference to use if you want to learn more true history about Christopher Columbus and how shitty he was and other stuff. There's plenty of other things. This contains a whole bunch of other stuff. So Lies My Teacher Told Me, definitely look at that one. We've got tons of books back there if y'all don't remember. But I do want to remind people in the chat that if you want to see me refute a Dan McClellan mythicism video, then you need to send in super chats. And currently there are no super chats, so I guess I am going to be done after this video as of right now. But also top fans are the Truth 666, KC, and Arc Radish, who's Chad. You guys are awesome. But all right, now let's get to this fact check here. So as I said, Christopher Columbus, it's mythology. What? More GE?
Little children, maybe a little too much.
Thank you, honey. I appreciate that. What? More GE? More GE. I appreciate you, honey. The greatest navigator of his age, that's obviously not false. He was not the first person to cross the Atlantic. That was Leif Erikson around 1000 AD, and that was nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus ever did anything. And Steven Crowder, whoever's writing the scripts for PragerU's, should have known that. So there's actual archaeological evidence at Les Saints aux Meadows in Newfoundland that confirms a Norse settlement dating back to 1021 AD, exactly 471 years before Columbus's voyage. While Columbus's voyages were historically significant for establishing permanent contact between Europe and the Americas, he was definitely not the first European to cross the Atlantic and reach the Americas. I think that it's pretty cool in the Assassin's Creed Valhalla game. There's a DLC that you can get where you can actually travel to the Americas, and you can actually be in the Americas and then travel back. That's a specific DLC. It was a pretty cool one to play through too. So some additional context here is that Columbus had access to maps and navigational knowledge. So that making that last part, or the one part that he had no maps whatsoever or anything like that. That's contrary to that, he did actually have access to maps and navigational knowledge. He used Portuguese navigational techniques and had access to charts through his marriage connections.
Hey,
Kentucky
just wanted
atheist
to say you don't have to be a good person to get into heaven. You just gotta suck my dick.
Let's see. Kentucky atheist said, "More super chats, folks."
You have been blessed by Christ. Now go forth and suck my dong.
And then Truth 666, who is a member, a free thinker member, like top tier member there, says, "I really enjoy your content and your take on things, so I would like to see you do more content." You sent in a $10 super chat, but so that's just going to count as one. So we still need 7 more. And so next time you consider sending in a super chat, do the $5 thing, and we'll be able to get our goal. But I do appreciate your super chats, all the super chats. Okay, all right, honey. If we get 9, then that just lowered it. So if we get 9 super chats, I can't change the super chat goal right now. But if we get 9, I'll do the McClellan video. And I guess subsequently after that, anybody that sends in anything more than $5 it'll take off from the total that we need. So all of that being said, all this right here that Stephen Crowder just said is totally wrong about Columbus. He is repeating the mythos that was generated in order to venerate Christopher Columbus instead of telling actual true history.
I don't know if y'all know this, but when you get to heaven, your moral actions are not judged. You're only judged for believing in me. Thank you.
Yeah, 666. Thank you again, True 666. Appreciate you. All right, so now we just need 8 more. Or wait, we only need 8, so we only need 4 more super chats. Huh? I am.
If you can name them, by the way, comment below, as I'm sure your professor can't.
No, professors, like history professors that would be teaching this would definitely know that it's the, oh, fuck me. I know it's the Santa Maria,
I don't know
Nina
if y'all
Pinta,
know this,
and
but
Santa
when you
Maria.
get to heaven, your moral actions are not judged. You're only judged for believing in me. Thank you.
Hyde says, appreciate your study and debates. Thank you so much. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we just need 4 more. Yes, we need 4 more. Wait, hold on. We got 10. Okay. I am getting distracted. So the history professor or something like that would definitely know about the Maria, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They would, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria would definitely know that thing. So I don't even know why he threw this in here. And I get that he's trying to be, I guess, confrontational, or maybe just a shithead in general. He's trying to be abrasive, but at the same time, like, you should do or say something that they wouldn't actually know. In fact, I bet you don't know that the Nina was not actually officially named the Nina. It was actually named the Santa Clara. Let me pull this up right here. See, the 1492 trip, the Nina was officially named the Santa Clara. So, like, I wonder if Stephen Crowder even knows that, but I'm guessing he probably doesn't. but I would expect anybody that has that is doing history in this particular area to know those kinds of things. So it just seems like a really dumb throwaway comment that he put in there just to insult professors or historians or something like that. I really don't fucking know.
But your professor probably has taught you the tale of Columbus as a villain, usually as a starting off point to indict the United States as a whole, often relying on a few key myths and some pivotal lies by omission. So
interesting that he's talking about myths and lies, because everything that he is going to regurgitate in this video are myths and lies. Maybe he doesn't believe that they're a lie, but maybe he fully believes in them, making them not lies coming out of his mouth, but they are lies that have been told and have convinced people. But I do want to point out here that I don't understand like the referencing of Christopher Columbus in order to denigrate the United States of America. I mean, obviously Christopher Columbus, that's a major, his trip across the Atlantic, the first one that established that constant contact between Europe and the North America. Like, the United States wouldn't be here even if it wasn't for that. But I don't think that you have to necessarily, shit on the United States for things that Christopher Columbus did or anything like that. And I wouldn't bring up Christopher Columbus in that particular respect, unless we're talking about how Europeans colonized the Americas and how the Europeans treated Native Americans and wiped them out, committing genocides and all that other kind of stuff. So like, if we're talking in that particular context, then yeah, sure, bring it up. But if we're talking about like how shitty the United States has been, or the different ways in which the United States has fucked up and mistreated indigenous peoples, I think that we can, actually cite more contextually relevant examples that even Steven Crowder himself he's gonna go through.
to start with, I'll bet that you probably believe Columbus and other European settlers to simply have committed mass genocide against Native Americans, indigenous. But here's the truth. While there were many examples of brutal warfare between Europeans and Native Americans, neither side actually committed genocide. In fact, there was never an outright policy of Indian extermination.
So there doesn't have to be an outright policy of indigenous peoples extermination in order for there to be an extermination, or at least a cognizant effort, not cognizant, but conscious effort to create an environment that would exterminate the indigenous populations. So this argument here, or this thing that he stated, is just misleading and factually problematic. While the term genocide requires careful historical analysis, Columbus and early Spanish colonizers did implement systemic policies of violence and enslavement and exploitation that devastated the indigenous populations. Columbus himself enslaved Native Americans, sending 500 as slaves to Spain in 1495, with about 200 dying during the voyage. Columbus then implemented a tribute system requiring indigenous people over 14 to provide specific amounts of gold or cotton, with severe punishments for non-compliance. And the Spanish colonial records document systemic violence, torture, and mass killings of indigenous peoples. Bartolomé de las Casas, a contemporary Spanish historian, documented extensive Spanish brutality and called it a genocide. So we don't need to mince words about this. It was a genocide, and they definitely created an environment that eventually exterminated the indigenous population, some of them completely, and others, their culture and their societies and people groups in general were just eradicated to the point where they did not survive as an entire people group. Now, there are people even now in Central America and in North America that are descended from those people, sure, but as far as them being a people group, they've been eradicated. Their culture has been eradicated, which is genocide. So for him to say that there was no policy of Native peoples, indigenous populations, I feel like that's being too hyper specific here as to what is required for a genocide, even one that they are conscious about doing. They knew what they were doing. They knew that it was going to devastate the indigenous populations, and eventually, as we'll see, that is exactly what they wanted.
The Native Americans were mostly wiped out through infectious diseases that the settlers had inadvertently brought with them. Of the estimated 250,000 natives in Hispaniola, Columbus's first stop in the Americas in 1492, new infectious diseases wiped out a staggering 95% of their population by 1517.
Okay, so this particular section has some accurate and inaccurate elements to it. While disease was a major factor in the population decline, the specific numbers and timeline are disputed, and the video omits Steven Crowder even omits that the role omits the role of the Spanish violence and exploitation. In the pre-Columbian population estimates for Hispaniola, those range widely from 100,000 to 4 million, with modern scholars actually favoring between 300 and 400,000. By 1517, the population had actually dropped to approximately 14,000 to 60,000. Disease was a major factor at this time, but Spanish violence, enslavement, and forced labor also contributed significantly to the population decline. What Crowder is trying to do is he's trying to levy all of the disease that was accidentally brought by the Spanish explorers, put all of the decline on the disease. But you cannot omit the fact that the enslavement and the way that the Spanish were treating the indigenous peoples, you can't omit that that was a factor, because it was a major factor. The 95% mortality rate is within the range of scholarly estimates that Stephen is presenting here, but it occurred over multiple decades and not just through disease. So that would be the straw man argument that he is making here, is that it was only disease, and in fact it was other things, due to the how the Spanish set up an environment that eventually eradicated the culture and the people indigenous to the Americas. Just as a reminder over there in the chat, we are still about 4 super chats away from getting a Dan McClellan response video. So if you want to see a response to Dan McClellan, definitely send in those super chats and I will pull one down as soon as we are done with Steven Crowder's dumbass here.
As far as genocide by violence, you can look at any historical account of even the most one-sided battles and find that they were still just that, battles. Take Wounded Knee, although hundreds of years later I only bring it up because I know that if I don't, you will. It's become ubiquitous with the idea of Native American genocide. After all, there were 150 to 350 Aboriginals killed or wounded. That's terrible. But there were also 25 American soldiers killed and 39 wounded. That's not genocide. That's a one-sided beatdown with Old Glory wielding the hammer.
What the feeling that I get from Steven Crowder, especially right here in this section, is that he's trying to be like, who's the guy who plays My Name is Earl? Earl and Jason Lee. I don't know if he's trying to be like Jason Lee, but it seemed like he puts off the persona, I guess, of like Jason Lee and his like asshole kind of character that he plays sometimes in the View Askew productions, like in Dogma or something like that. That's what he puts off. That it's almost like he saw that character from Dogma and he's like, I can be an asshole like that. And then that's the character that he's trying to portray himself as here. So this is a very misleading claim here. And it definitely minimizes the battle of Wounded Knee. It was actually a massacre, just an outright massacre. One thing I want you to notice here in this in this thing is that, for one thing, how he says that the Battle of Wounded Knee, I'm using air quotes here, Battle of Wounded Knee, is represented in mainstream is like, oh, the United States military murdered, poor not Indians, Native people and everything like that. And notice how this is portrayed as being all men, and it's very obviously like there's the chief and all this other stuff. They're just all men, right? That is mythology. That is like something that was made up in order to minimize what actually happened at the massacre of Wounded Knee, because it was a massacre. The casualty figures that Stephen presents are actually accurate, but it's the characterization that he goes through that's problematic. There were nearly 300 Lakota people that were killed, with more than 250 confirmed dead and up to 300 total casualties. And over half of those that were killed were women, children, and elderly tribal members, most of whom were unarmed. The 25 U.S. soldiers that died and 39 that were wounded, many of those soldier casualties were from friendly fucking fire. Historians and official records classify this as a massacre, not a battle. It is due to the disproportionate casualties and targeting of non-combatants. That's what makes it a massacre. They didn't go in to, like, you know, have a battle. They were going in to exterminate these people. And that was their goal. And that's what they did. They massacred them. I'm getting a lot of like Old Testament biblical vibes here, because that is exactly what the biblical God would have commanded, that you go in and you kill everybody in that people group. That was biblical. If you want to talk about some kind of biblical battle, that's what it looks like. The event is widely recognized as marking the end of any organized Native American resistance in the Americas. So, like, they obviously got their message across, but the way that Stephen Crowder, as well as the mythos,
just wanted to say, you don't have to be a good person to get into heaven. You just gotta suck my dick.
But thank you, Late Night Kaiju, for sending in your 5, and then love your content. Let's do this, Salty Bits. Thank you so much. We still need about 3 more super chats, like two or three more super chats in order to get a Dan McClellan. Huh? See, let me do a manual counting here before we continue. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, we just need 1 more. I don't know why that didn't count. That one definitely should have counted. Maybe it's because it was 5 pounds. I'm not sure. But we just need 1 more super chat in order to do Dan McClellan video. So if you want to see that, get it in and I'll download it. So obviously, Stephen Crowder and PragerU are trying to advance the mythos around this quote unquote Battle of Wounded Knee, which was actually a massacre. And that, it being labeled a massacre is actually acknowledged by both historians and official records. So they're just, they are providing myth and they are advancing myth and they are lying to their audience. Which I say lie because they should be able to do the necessary research to figure out that what they are putting out here is the mythos. And they're definitely being apologists for the massacre of innocent indigenous people. And that is a wrong thing. But, you know, as we'll hear from Stephen here, I think here in a minute, at some point, he admits this is horrible. But at the same time, like, he's not, he's definitely defending, like, the action of venerating, Christopher Columbus.
Hammer. And sometimes the massacres went the other direction. See the Apaches for reference, or the Comanches, or a dozen or so other tribes.
Okay, so this is a particular fallacy that I'm actually seeing a whole lot more now that I'm interacting, like, in the more political space, but it's tukuke. And that's, basically saying, oh, well, they did these things, so it's okay that we do that thing to them, the same thing. And that doesn't justify, the extermination of indigenous peoples, just because there were complex political and other kinds, economic and cultural clashes between different indigenous groups does not justify the wanton murder and massacre of the indigenous peoples. Stephen Crowder is trying to minimize what was done to the indigenous peoples by saying, oh, well, they were doing it to each other. Ah, fuck.
Tater's gonna tate.
Infidel got in right there. I don't think it didn't, let's see, the goal got ended, but Infidel, I'll definitely count yours. Thank you so much. So we will be doing, I just want more
Jesus
GE.
loves the
Thank
little
you.
children, maybe a little too much.
So I guess we will be doing a Dan McClellan video today. So yeah, I know that we didn't officially meet the goal, but I'm gonna go ahead and honor it because I'm like that. Yeah, for the amount, not necessarily meeting it within some kind of goal. But anyways, I like Dan. I just wanted to play. Oh, Infidel says wrong color, and of course, KC said I just want more GE. So obviously, this is a tukake fallacy. Just because there was strife between indigenous groups does not justify the wanton slaughter, murder, and extermination of those indigenous peoples. Yeah.
The natives often gave as good as they got. Not exactly the way
just
genocide.
wanted to say you don't have to be a good person to get into heaven. You just gotta suck my dick.
Thank you, Salty Bits, for being a stand-up guy. Thank you so much there, Salty Bits. I appreciate you.
Side usually tends to work. Here's another thing I bet you've been made to believe. That many Native Americans, sorry, American Indians, sorry, I don't know what, take your pick, lived in.
Okay, this is yet another like really low down kind of like shitty thing to do. I mean, obviously Steven Crowder's doing it because nobody can push back against him, right? He's just recording a video and he can be as shitty as he wants to. But doing it like this, like Native Americans, American Indians, obviously I wouldn't use American Indians personally, but I don't know how, Native Americans or indigenous peoples feel about the label American Indians, but still, he's trying to make it out to be like leftist and progressives. They just don't know what to call the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And regardless of how you title or label the indigenous peoples, I think that we can definitely move past the misnomer of them being Indians, because Columbus thought that he landed in India, so he called them Indians. It would be incorrect to call them Indians because they're not Indians. I mean, American Indians, I guess, would be a bit more accurate, but I mean, we're not confused as to who these people were and still are.
Harmony with the environment until Columbus arrived and European settlers destroyed the land with their evil technology. Truth, not only did the natives brutally take out people, but they took out entire forests and hunted species to extinction. Squatting Bear and his First Nation buddies weren't hopping into kayaks to block whaling ships, probably because they were too busy killing seals to waterproof their kayaks.
Well, here's one thing that I've always liked about, indigenous people here in America, in the Americas, like, pre the extermination, obviously, is that they definitely would, try to be as conservative as possible as far as like, using elements from their environment, either hunting, hunting wildlife or whatever. Now that doesn't mean that some of what Stephen is saying here isn't correct, because some of it is. The claim that he's making is partially accurate, but it lacks important context about the scale and nature of pre-Columbian environmental impact. So Native Americans did have environmental impacts, including controlled burning, hunting pressure on wildlife, and some localized species depletion. Of course, Stephen made it out to be like they just hunted to extinction some animals, and and he made it seem to be like it was a more common thing than it actually was. But in any case, the scale was dramatically different from the European impacts, and that's the important part, is that the scale of impact was vastly different from the indigenous peoples to the European colonizers. Native Americans used controlled burns for land management and habitat improvement. Some megafauna extinctions occurred during the Pleistocene period, when humans first arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago, but this predates Columbus by by millennia. Most Native American groups practice sustainable resource management adapted to their local environments. The idea that Native Americans living in harmony with nature is overly romanticized, but their environmental impact was generally sustainable compared to the European colonial practices. And that's what I was trying to get across, is that they were definitely cognizant of their effect on their environment, and they were definitely looking to build a sustainable civilization as opposed to the colonizers who came over and they just destroyed, hunted, and killed both people as well as wildlife and destroyed the environment around them. So the scale and impact are notably different with the Native Americans. They tried to build sustainable types of impact or sustainable presence as opposed to the destructive nature of the European colonizers.
You also probably believe that the Native American, two-spirited First Nation something or other culture was a beautiful pantheistic one of peace.
I mean, again, taking the lowdown, shitty, tact of throwing that emotional rhetoric out there that progressives are just confused, or leftists are just confused about, these people, these groups of people, these people groups, sorry. But obviously, if we're going to be teaching like the Native American history as well as pre-Columbian history down in the Americas and everything like that, we're obviously not going to represent them as just all happy-go-lucky, one pantheistic piece, one apiece kind of thing. We are definitely cognizant and conscious of the different interactions between native groups in the Americas, how they waged war against one another, how brutal sometimes that war was. So it wasn't all happy-go-lucky kind of shit, but that would also, if you were taking a class, it would be mentioned in there that, there were warring tribes. They disagreed and they fought for economic and political and societal control over other groups. And so that would just be something that was taught. So Steven Crowder is just flat out wrong and presenting another straw man argument about what is being taught to people in schools, either children or young adults.
The truth is, not so much. When Columbus arrived, the islands were inhabited by two main tribes: the Arawaks, who were passive and friendly, and the Caribs, who were vicious cannibals.
Another bit of misinformation here. And it's just part of that mythos that was actually created around Columbus's time. So this is vastly oversimplified and it is very inaccurate. Recent archaeological evidence actually challenges these long-standing assumptions about Caribbean people. So the traditional peaceful Arawak versus the cannibal Carib narrative have actually been questioned by modern anthropologists. Recent skull analysis suggests that Caribs were present in the northern Caribbean islands, lending some credence to what Columbus claimed. But the cannibal characterization may have been exaggerated or misinterpreted by Columbus based on limited observations. And I bet you're wondering, what were those observations? We're going to get to those here in a second. But the relationship between different Caribbean groups was very complex, involving both cooperation and conflict. Columbus's accounts were influenced by European mythological expectations about savage people, but it also had another reason for Columbus to portray the Caribs as cannibals. Hold on, let me get to my other section of my notes here real quick. Second. Okay. So, So this whole cannibal myth was actually a political tool, and it was not a historical reality. So the Spanish had a significant legal problem when they got here in the Caribbean, and as far as how they were handling the indigenous people. So Queen Isabella of 1503, her law protected indigenous peoples from enslavement. Columbus needed a way around this humanitarian protection to continue his exploitation operations, because he got here in 1492 and then he obviously went back. That's when Queen Isabella, she stated that all indigenous peoples in that area were considered to be part of the Spanish territory and were therefore Spanish citizens, so you couldn't enslave them. So Columbus needed a way around this. The solution was very cynical. Cannibalism was designated as a crime against God, and that made enslavement legal for them. So historical records make it clear that cannibalism was the perfect solution, which would make legal Carib enslavement. All those who would resist the Spaniards were called cannibals, and therefore deserved to be enslaved for committing this crime against God. This system became self-perpetuating. It's recorded as being all of a sudden every native person in the entire Caribbean became a Carib as far as the colonists were concerned. And any indigenous resistance was reframed as cannibalistic behavior, justifying violent suppression. So as far as the archaeological evidence goes for this particular section, most modern archaeological investigations have found no evidence supporting widespread cannibalism. When Spanish colonizers first found human bones in a Colonial village, they instantly jumped to the conclusion that they must have been cannibals. However, scholars now understand that those bones were likely used for ancestral veneration rituals or other religious practices. Dr. Reg Murphy's archaeological team working in Antigua since 2013 found that Carib peoples primarily subsisted on shellfish and fish rather than human flesh. Their comprehensive analysis of bones, pollen, and artifacts revealed no evidence of cannibalistic practices. So there are a number of linguistic and cultural relationships between the Arawak and the Carib groups of people. This supposed divide that Columbus reported was far more complex than the European account suggests. Modern anthropological research reveals that there's a shared linguistic heritage. Both groups spoke languages from the Arawakian language family, and the island Caribs, the Kalinago, spoke what was essentially an Arawakian language, not a separate Caribbean language. Or Caribbean language. There was also cultural continuity. What Europeans labeled as distinct Carib and Arawak people were often related populations with shared cultural practices and beliefs. The distinctions were more about political alliances and territorial control than fundamental cultural differences. And there were obviously European misunderstandings of indigenous politics. Columbus heavily relied on hearsay. His accounts of cannibalistic Caribs came primarily from Taino informants who described their enemies. This created a telephone game effect where political conflicts were reinterpreted through European expectations about savage people. The political complexity. The Caribbean contained multiple chiefdoms, trade networks, and shifting political alliances. Europeans simplified this into a false binary of peaceful Arawaks versus warlike Caribs that served their colonization narrative but ignored indigenous political sophistication. So there's obviously a lot of things that are being missed out in this representation that we're seeing up here on the screen. I mean, notice how they're even this cartoon characterization of what's up here is, the entire tribe was that way. The entire tribe was evil cannibals. The men, the women, even the children were fucking little cannibals running around wanting to bite your ankles, quite literally. And so it's very obvious that PragerU and Steven Crowder are pushing the mythos that was created in order to justify the enslavement of the Carib people, the native indigenous population there that was resistant to Columbus and the other Spanish colonials. it's very obvious that that was the only reason why they labeled them as cannibals. And so to represent them in this kind of light shows that you're looking to push a narrative, a justification narrative for the enslavement of these people, that they somehow deserved it because they were cannibals. And that's exactly how Columbus used it. And that's how the conservatives, you know, Stephen Crowder, PragerU, are trying to continue that particular mythos today to justify enslaving those people. Sorry, that I know that was like a lot of information that I just dropped on everybody pretty quick there.
Arawaks actually lived in fear of the Caribs for, you guessed it, the reasons being that they hunted them down to enslave them and eat them. Yes, eat them. Ironically, we get the name Caribbean Islands from those famous people eaters. The only...
Again, not people eaters. There's no evidence of them being people eaters whatsoever. And also the division between the peaceful Arawaks and the, you know, human eating Caribs, that was all in an effect to justify the slavery of some of those individuals. And even the ones that were not like enslaved in that kind of way. If you remember Christopher Columbus, he actually instantiated that whole tributary system where you all people, you know, 14 years and up had to mine and provide certain amounts of different minerals and different things to the Spaniards. And if they didn't, then they were definitely subjected to poor treatment. They had serious consequences for not paying your tribute. So even the peaceful Arawaks that they're describing here, which, you know, is not like a separate group of people, even they were exploited by the Spaniards. So like, there's no justification here for the representation that PragerU is putting off.
The only way settlers were able to conquer this land was through the help of Native Americans who teamed up with them to settle the score with other tribes who were even bigger jerks than they were. It's not even to mention the populations in Central and South America famous for ritual human sacrifice. You think Cortez was able to command and conquer with only 500 or so conquistadors? Of course not. It took 50,000 screaming, angry allied natives who'd had it up to here with being tortured, enslaved, and forced to carry gold for the other native Aztecs.
This is also misleading. It's partially accurate. The numbers that he's presenting here are somewhat accurate, but the representation that he's putting forth is obviously not accurate. So, so his numbers as far as the 50,000 screaming angry allied natives is a pretty big underestimation of the scale of the indigenous involvement. Cortez had initially approximately between 400 and 600 soldiers. So that part is somewhat correct. Indigenous allies were crucial and numbered much higher than 50,000. The one particular group, Tlaxcalans, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that group's name, alone provided up to 110,000 warriors for the final assault on Tenochtitlan, sorry. Additional allies included 50,000 Texicocans and forces from other groups. Total indigenous allies likely numbered 150,000 to 200,000 warriors. And the conquest was fundamentally independent of indigenous, or fundamentally dependent on indigenous allies who had their own political motivations for opposing the Aztec Empire, which is kind of interesting there, which I did expand on this a little bit as far as you know, what was the historical reality behind why there was allied natives helping the Spanish conquistadors like Cortez in this particular situation. So there was an Aztec tribute system. The Aztec Empire operated through a tributary system that was genuinely oppressive to conquered peoples. The subject cities had to pay a semi-annual tribute in goods, labor, and military service, provide warriors for Aztec military campaigns, and supply luxury goods, agricultural products, and precious materials. However, this wasn't primarily about just carrying gold or whatnot, as Stephen Crowder and PragerU are suggesting here, but rather a comprehensive system of economic and political control. Now, these, conquered peoples were long-standing political rivalries. The most important of the Spanish allies, the Tlaxcalans, Tlaxcalans. I could probably put this into like Google and say like, hey, pronounce this shit for me. Let's see. I forgot to put the word.
Mexican state called Tlaxcala. Tlaxcalans.
Yeah, okay. Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans, they were the most important Spanish allies, and they had been independent enemies of the Aztecs for nearly a century, and they fought in the Flower Wars against them. And they were surrounded by Aztecs' territory, but they were never conquered. Their alliance with Spain was fundamentally about maintaining their independence. They did this as a strategic opportunity for regional power. Indigenous leaders like one of the leaders saw Cortez as a powerful ally who could help destroy the Aztec Empire and create a space for the Tlaxcalan expansion. This was less about liberation from oppression and more about seizing a strategic opportunity to eliminate their primary rival. There was also commercial blockade, and they wanted relief from that. The Aztecs had imposed a commercial blockade on Tlaxcala, making them poor and lacking essential goods like salt and cotton. An alliance with Spain offered economic relief. And so, and here's where they get it really wrong, is the oversimplified oppression narrative. While the Aztec tribute demands were burdensome, the video here presents a simplistic good versus evil narrative. Many tributary relationships involved local autonomy as long as the tribute was paid. The Aztecs often left local rulers in power. It also mischaracterizes the scale of the violence. Stephen Crowder and PragerU used the phrase tortured, enslaved, and forced to carry gold. And that exaggerates the typical tribute relationship. The most tribute was in agricultural goods, textiles, and local products, not in gold extraction. Stephen Crowder and PragerU also ignore indigenous agency. This video, they portray indigenous allies as simply reading the reacting to Aztec oppression, when in reality they were sophisticated political actors making calculated decisions about regional power dynamics. And so in the broader context of all this, indigenous allies provided massive military support, far exceeding the 50,000 that we've already discussed. And so there was a very complex system and complex reasons why the allies, or there were indigenous allies of Cortez to take out the Aztecs. And it was these are problems that have been plaguing the area and plaguing these groups of people for a century at least. So portraying it as the indigenous people helped us wipe out their own people. Well, one of the things that they're not covering here is the effect after the Aztecs were defeated, and that's that the indigenous allies that helped the Spanish, they were put through a sort of system that was actually far more oppressive and eventually ended up wiping them out. So, like, it was not replaced by something better. Essentially, the Spaniards, they used that the issues that the Tlaxcalans were having with the Aztecs. They used those issues in order to convince them to help them wipe them out, only to just wipe out the Tlaxcalans anyways. So, they're totally glossing over such a complex discussion and complex history here in order to make it seem like, oh, the indigenous people helped wipe themselves out. That still does not justify the extermination of entire people groups.
At some point, they decided to roll the dice and go with the guys sporting funny beards and metal hats.
See, that's really minimizing the reasons why they allied themselves with the Spanish and to take out the Aztecs. It's very obvious that it was a lot more political. It was a lot more economic as far as the motivations go, and to make it out to be like, oh, it's just rolling the fucking die. What's up? Stop the stupidity. Appreciate you. But it's a lot more complex than just rolling a fucking die. That's not what they did. It was cold, it was calculated, and they saw the Spaniards as being the best way to gain that territorial control, only to have it ripped away from them by the Spaniards themselves.
None of this is to say that the early settlers were perfect, or that they didn't carry out their fair share of pretty scummy stuff, but to use America's mistakes as the brush with which to paint the entirety of its history while completely ignoring the indigenous lifestyle of barbarism and borderline evil is inaccurate at best, dishonest at worst.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think that it's dishonest or inaccurate to highlight the problems of the Spanish colonials, like either Christopher Columbus or the conquistadors that came later. It's not inaccurate to say that they were horrible people that enslaved people, that created the Atlantic slave trade, and that exterminated entire people groups. And he's really trying to minimize that particular aspect of it by saying, oh, these weren't like good people because they, practice human sacrifice and all these other barbaric rituals and everything like that. It's like, yeah, sure, they were doing that, but that doesn't justify the extermination of the entire people group. This sounds a lot like the Old Testament sort of logic around why the Midianites were wiped out. Because whenever I try to argue with religious apologists, Christian apologists about Numbers 31, they always tell me like, oh, well, they were committing atrocities like sacrificing babies. And it's like, okay, so you're trying to tell me that the godly solution, the solution that God came up with was, oh, before they sacrifice their own children, I want you to go in and kill those kids for me. Like, that turns it into, oh, I'm just jealous that they're killing kids for another God. I want you to kill those kids for your God, being me. And it seems like that logic is the same as the logic that's being told here. They were committing atrocities, so therefore that makes it okay to commit atrocities on them, which is, if you'll remember at the beginning of our stream today, is a tu kuke. That doesn't justify exterminating entire people groups just because they had a major cultural difference in, the sacrificing of individuals and ritualistic sacrifice. But PragerU, Stephen Crowder, they're trying to minimize what was done to the indigenous populations by saying, well, they weren't great either. And they're calling it inaccurate and dishonest to point out how shitty the colonialists were and the conquistadors and Christopher Columbus. Like, oh, it's shitty to mention that without mentioning how they ate people and sacrificed people. And it's like, no, we can acknowledge both things. The Spanish were shitty, and the conquistadors, Columbus and all them, they were real shitty and everything. And but there were also some horrible atrocities committed by indigenous peoples. I think that the fact that horrible shit was committed by both groups is just indicative of the human condition. Humans in general can be very brutal. They can be horrible. They can be shitty, sure, but that doesn't justify wiping out entire groups of people. Let's see, he said something else here. Can't remember.
Perfect. Or that they didn't carry out their fair share of...
Oh, yeah, hold on. I just now remembered. There. He's talking about how we're relating this back to America and Western culture, I guess, and how we should feel shitty for, our past to include the colonization of the Americas. And I still maintain that we can acknowledge the shitty nature of our past and how shitty the conquistadors, as well as the colonials in North America, as well as other parts of the Americas. We can acknowledge how shitty they were and how dirty they did the indigenous peoples, and how the indigenous peoples didn't deserve to be wiped out. And we can recognize the atrocities that were committed against them, while at the same time moving forward and progressing forward so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that were made in the past. I think that it's integral to a progressive and free society that we recognize the horrible shit that was done in the past so that we're not continuously doing that stuff in the future. And to whitewash and minimize what was done in the past as being justified in some kind of way, I think that all that does is create an environment so that we can reoffend certain groups of people. We're seeing it right now with the LGBT community. We're seeing it with the immigrant community. We're seeing it all over the place in America right now. We're seeing people, out there, and they're needlessly portraying like undocumented people as being, bad actors, like criminals and everything like that, when really they're just trying to work and they're trying to be productive members of society. And you can draw parallels to what Columbus did to the Caribbean people and the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. You can draw parallels from that to what we're seeing now in our current political sphere, where the conservatives are trying to do the exact same shit that Columbus was doing. They're trying to paint all immigrants, all undocumented individuals, all anybody that they don't like as being these bad actors, as these violent people or whatnot. But I got to tell you right now, there's only one group of people out there that's proudly walking around with guns on their shirts and that have put up political campaigns that are like, come on, it's time to go rhino hunting. Yeah, I've actually, in searching through some videos this weekend, I actually found a political ad that had a guy with a shotgun like, let's go rhino hunting, advocating for violence, like conservative violence on other conservatives for not being conservative enough. Does that sound familiar to what's currently going on in our socio-political situation? I mean, they are trying to do the exact same shit over and over. What has worked in the past so that they can enslave people and they can treat people like they're subhuman pieces of shit. They're continuously doing it over and over and over again.
There were plenty of bloody, horrendous battles between the Europeans and the Indians. When a Neolithic tribe encounters a more technologically advanced people, the guys with the boom boom sticks usually win. Columbus is not the issue here and never was. This whole Indigenous Peoples Day charade is about teaching your children to despise Western civilization and anybody who dare defend it. But, and again, that could just be my Western civ privilege talking.
I mean, it's definitely white cis het male privilege talking. Definitely. I mean, I think that Steven Crowder definitely fits into that. And everything that he spouted here, the lies, the misrepresentations of not only Columbus's actual history, but also the history of how Europeans have treated indigenous people here in America. I mean, all of that comes from a place of privilege, white conservative privilege, very obviously. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to brainwash people into thinking that, oh, Columbus was, a good guy with some problems or something like that. Really trying to minimize his impact on the indigenous people and how he set up like the environment that eventually led to the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas. So like, minimizing that and whitewashing it down, yeah, that's from a place of privilege, you piece of shit.
Happy Columbus Day.
No, I say happy Indigenous Peoples Day, because I think that we need to recognize what we have done in the past, just like I've done in this live stream so far. Recognize the horrible atrocities that have been done in the past, and so that we can progress forward and not commit those atrocities again. But the conservatives are stuck in the past consistently. They are stuck in the past, and they want to act like, doing the exact same shit that Columbus did in characterizing, the indigenous people that weren't going to just placate to their needs as being, cannibals so that they could be enslaved. I think that that's the exact same situation that we're running into now. Well, a little bit less on the whole enslavement bit, potentially, because I do think that if they could get away with it, they would definitely enslave undocumented individuals, because, as soon as they kick them all out of the United States, we're going to be hurting on farmland and all this other stuff. So like, I think that we're only a few months away from the first inklings of that, but I'm hope that I'm proven wrong about that. But Steven Crowder and PragerU are definitely trying to brainwash America into thinking that treating people that they've othered as being subhuman or deserve this horrible treatment I hope that it doesn't work, but it seems like, considering that this was a 7-year-old video and we're now seeing the exact same shit now, it seems to have worked at least on some portion of the population. So I don't know. PragerU is actually going to be used in some in some school districts. Like, as I think Florida is one. I think maybe Texas might be one. I know Oklahoma is trying to reverse a bunch of the shit that they were kind of doing over there. But in any case, no, definitely. I'm not celebrating Columbus Day, but I am celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day so that we don't repeat the exact same atrocities that have happened in the past, and so that we can progress forward as a human, just in general, human civilization progressing forward, so that we provide a better society and a more free society where we treat individuals as with the dignity that they deserve. And it seems like the conservatives definitely don't want that. They want to whitewash history. They want to minimize the atrocities that were done to indigenous people. And I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong for the fact that you're not representing reality. I think that anybody that is misrepresenting truth and are telling, people lies about history to prevent, the progressive policies that could come from it, I think that that's doing harm. And so I guess what I'm saying is that PragerU, Steven Crowder, they are both doing harm in this video. And of course, PragerU just in general does harm. All right, heathens. Well, we are going to be, hold on, let me get, oh shit, I forgot that thing is working. So we are going to be doing a Dan McClellan video today, but just to round out this Steven Crowder and PragerU video, was not convinced and is actually pretty sad that you can draw direct parallels from how they tell the story about Columbus and how they minimize the atrocities done to the indigenous people to what's going on currently in our socio-political environment. Seeing the Trump administration, other individuals in our society, and make them out to be like they are either subhuman or they don't deserve the same rights that they should be afforded as afforded to other people that in our society. I think that you can draw direct parallels to how they have whitewashed Columbus's past and how Columbus actually portrayed the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean so that he could enslave some of them. It's very obvious that this has been the conservative rhetoric for a long time. And I don't think that we should allow that to continue. And I think that, people should be pushing back against this kind of thing. And you can use like how Columbus misrepresented the indigenous people to be able to slave them. You can use that as an example of how we shouldn't be doing that now, which is what the Trump administration is doing. But if you don't want to stick around for the Dan McClellan video, I totally understand. And if you're leaving out, I hope that you have a fabulous rest of your Indigenous Peoples Day. And I guess I will talk to you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. But I am going to go and find one of Dan's videos, and I am going to just download that real quick. Get that into my little folder here. So if y'all will... Oh, I mean, I do have some ready. I just kind of decided on the fly, like, kind of, huh? Yeah. Let's see. Mythicist. Okay. So there's one that's like 24 minutes long. And they're all vertical. Hold on. Let's see. I could have sworn that I saw one that was like not a vertical video. Pro-abortion. No. I'm so sorry, everybody. Oh, on the dogma of mythicism. That's 21 minutes. Did Jesus really exist? That's the one I think that I want to do. Okay. Now, this isn't the most recent one that I'm seeing. as far as mythicism goes, but let's see, share, copy. Sorry, I'm talking my way through getting this actually downloaded. Let's see, paste link, and it's going to go into the folder that I got the PragerU one in, which helps because it's all in the same stream. It is a 20-minute video. I'm going to try to get through it as quick as possible. Because there's not going to be, I feel like there's probably going to be only minor things that I disagree with Dan on about this, but we'll just have to see. All right, there we go.
So I made a video.
Oh yeah, I can't use my stream thingy. There we go. All right. All right, so welcome. I am reviewing Dan McClellan's video that is entitled, Did Jesus Really Exist? And so I have listened and watched through this one a little bit. I don't remember exactly what is said in it. I do remember that I disagreed with the person that Dan is presenting here. This first thing that says Stitch Incoming, the guy who's talking there. I do remember that I agreed with Dan on some things because I did not agree with the original video maker. And Dan gets right, but I will definitely try to step in and point out where I disagree with Dan on this.
So I made a video yesterday talking about how the conspiracy theory that I believe in is that Jesus never actually existed.
Okay, so first of all, if you're gonna, I want to disagree with the guy that Dan is responding to here because, I really disagree with the representation that it's a it's conspiracy theory like that. I don't, at least minimal mythicism, I don't think is a conspiracy because there's evidence for the position and it's a likelihood conclusion, like Jesus probably didn't exist, and it doesn't require a conspiracy. It just requires understanding certain aspects of first century Jewish and Jewish Christian culture, as well as what was being taught at the time and everything like that. So like, I feel like it's very dependent on that. So it's definitely not conspiratorial. So I don't like the framing of that the guy presented, but let's see what Dan has. And I do one thing I want to compliment. Let's do a compliment sandwich with this video. I do love that Dan has these fun shirts. Now, obviously, I've got the AXP, fuck God shirt on today. If you guys don't know or remember, see if that shows. Fuck God is what it says. So like, I definitely appreciate his fun stuff, his fun shirts and everything like that. And he makes sure to highlight his fit or whatever. My fit is about fucking God, though.
All right, let's see it.
And a lot of people responded to that, and they wanted to know a little bit more. They wanted to know why I don't think Jesus existed. So I thought tonight I would make a short video detailing the primary reason why. According to the Gospels, Jesus was extremely famous. He was known throughout the land. People would flock from miles around to hear him preach or even get healed. He brought at least one person back from the dead. So keeping all that in mind, how come nobody ever wrote down anything about him until years and years and years after he was dead?
Okay, so obviously what I'm going to say about that is that those were stories that were constructed from Old Testament stories, and they were fabricated, and there's no way to know if any of those stories are actually historically accurate. And so there was definitely a theological purpose behind all of those stories. And I think that it's at least important to note. I feel like what the creator should have done is like there were historians recording such actions that were being done at the time. There were historians that were recording, failed messiahs. And if Jesus was seen as a failed messiah and that, he was widely known to be doing those things, then he would somebody would have definitely written about it in some kind of way, even if it was just sort of like a one sentence throwaway kind of thing. We would definitely be able to see that in history. I would not expect, and I don't think that people should expect full accountings of those actions. I would expect, the kind of minimal type of reporting that we see like in Josephus, which I know Josephus, I get it. There are references to failed messiahs in Josephus, though, that are not contested by textual critics as far as them being interpolations and everything like that. So I do trust those as being actually by Josephus, but it's because of how he writes and how those references actually follow the general structure of how Josephus writes. So, yeah, let's see what Dan has to say about it.
So this is a wonderful question, and there are a handful of things to consider. The first thing to consider is the way that Jesus is represented in the Gospels doesn't necessarily reflect the life or the achievements of the actual historical Jesus. Because what the overwhelming majority of scholars agree on is that the best way to account for how the data got to be the way they are in terms of the different accounts across the text of the New Testament, the traditions that were in circulation, the following that grew following the death of Jesus, the best way to account for all that is by positing a historical figure who lived and died. And
well, you see, and that's where I disagree with Dan. I don't think that it takes like a real historical figure because, there were very obviously other, savior figures that died and resurrected and provided, the same kind of things that Jesus was talking about providing. And they had significant followings too, but none of them actually existed. Like in the mystery cults, none of their savior figures actually existed. And it was actually taught inside the mystery cults that all of the stories about their savior figures were actually celestial. And we've got direct evidence of that in like Plutarch's Moralia, where he was talking about the Isis and Osiris cult and how to the outside group of individuals, it was taught that they were historical stories, and that was just to bring people in and initiate them. And once they got initiated, it was revealed that they were actually celestial stories. And so we find that, at least as far as the language of mystery cults are found in Paul's writings, whenever he discusses some of the finer aspects of how Christianity was structured in Paul's time. And so what we see is that there doesn't necessarily need to be a historical person in order to spark a movement. There does need to be people that are teaching those things about that figure in that cult, and that has to can motivate people to be part of that cult. But we don't need the savior figure to actually be a historical figure. What Dan is admitting to here is that it's just an ad hoc assumption that Jesus existed. And as I've shown in my conversation with Dr. Richard Carrier, in analyzing Dr. Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Really Exist class, the 2 lectures that he's got about that, it seems like it's from that point that most historicists then interpret information that's in Paul. And so they're essentially doing a giant circular argument. They first assume that Jesus existed, and then they interpret Paul through that lens of that assumption in order to prove that Jesus existed, which makes a complete circle. So essentially I just disagree with Dan here on this, that it doesn't take a historical figure in order to spark a movement and to gather the masses like that, especially if you're looking to convert Jews into this new sect of Judaism, because sects of Judaism were all over the Mediterranean at that time. There were different sects that were sometimes wildly different beliefs than the Orthodoxy. And so, it seems like Christianity originally started out as just a different sect of Jews, which when you put it in that context, it's really simple to just envision a mythological beginning for the Christ figure as opposed to like a real historical beginning.
To whose biography and life all these other details accreted. So the overwhelming majority of scholars, virtually all scholars of relevant disciplines, agree there would have been a historical Jesus.
So this is amounting to an appeal to authority. just saying that, all of these scholars, they believe this thing, without actually providing significant evidence to justify the assumption that he's presenting here. He's just saying, all the scholars believe this, and that's the assumption, so that's what we're going with. And I don't know if he means it as like, all New Testaments, because when he says scholars and historians, he doesn't mean like the only relevant scholars and historians are going to be New Testament scholars and New Testament historians, and textual critics and everything. And those are the only relevant ones to this, because those are the only ones that are investigating this particular topic. So when he says all of them, he means all of the Christians and the minority of non-Christians that are New Testament scholars. But I would contend that most of those New Testament scholars are actually just educated apologists. And that's what it seems to amount to, is that the majority of New Testament scholars are really just apologists in a scholarly mask. And I'm not saying that Dan is one of those. I think Dan really is trying to do like significant scholarship and follow the data. But I think that he's working off of a faulty set of data here. And I think the faulty set of data is due to this just primary assumption that Jesus definitely existed. And so
what we read in the Gospels doesn't necessarily reflect what that historical Jesus actually did. So when we talk about having throngs and throngs of people following him and him raising people from the dead, those are almost certainly part of the posthumous accretions to the tradition. Certainly the historical Jesus that is reconstructed by scholars had some kind of following.
So my question about this particular point here is like, what is the methodology that you used in order to discern the historical facts that this historical Jesus is recreated with? Because I feel like the only real evidence we have of this Jesus figure comes from Paul. And because I don't think that there's any kind of method that you could apply to the Gospels and be able to filter out any of the made up shit and only have the historical stuff, like the most likely historical things. I mean, obviously all the magical shit in the Gospels is not like real, but what I'm talking about is applying a method to the Gospels that will filter out those non-magical claims down to the historical claims about Jesus and the most likely historically real things about this figure. I don't think that method actually exists. I think at some level you have to start adding assumptions into it. And I think that most New Testament scholars and historians, they are going to start with the assumption that Jesus was a historical figure, and then they just use their own vibes in order to pick out which historical traits are truly historical as opposed to just made up bullshit.
But it wasn't a following that would have captured the attention of the Roman Empire unless and until he goes and does something like starts a riot in the temple during the Passover. And then the local authorities say, well, he's got to be put to death. So the first thing to note is we've got to separate the historical Jesus from the Jesus of the Gospels. And we cannot take the Gospels' representation of the life and the achievements and the events of Jesus as representative of the historical figure that we're trying to reconstruct or we're trying to find in the historical record.
I definitely agree with Dan on this point. I think that if you're going to be arguing about a fictional Jesus, then you're going to need to filter out most of the claims from the Gospels as far as like what is historical, especially the claims that the original poster or the original video that Dan is responding to is making, because those were obviously inspired outside of the historical record as far as like any kind of historical Jesus could be identified. And so you can't conflate those two figures, the magical gospel Jesus and the actual historical Jesus. You need to pick one and stick with it. If you want to argue that the gospel Jesus is fictional and never existed, I think that you're going to find wide support not only in the non-dogmatic Christian side of the New Testament scholarship, and that would include both Christians and both Christians and non-Christians in the New Testament space, New Testament scholarship. But you would also find wide support among atheists out there, because they are definitely going to be on your side that, yeah, that Jesus didn't exist. A lot of people like to confuse a position that the gospel Jesus didn't exist with mythicism. And I mean, maybe you could consider that like a mythicism light or something like that, but I really advise against using mythicism for that position, because unless you're saying that there was no historical Jesus, and Jesus, at least the Christ figure from Paul and the Gospels, was only ever purely mythological and never a real historical figure, I think that is the only thing that you could really deem as being mythicist. If you're just simply saying the gospel Jesus didn't exist, then I wouldn't use mythicism to describe that position.
Next thing to note is the type of movement Jesus led. This was an apocalyptic movement. Jesus thought that the end of the world was going to happen immediately. So within the following, you have no reason to write anything down for posterity, because everything is coming to an end anyway. Now, that kind of archivist mindset or intuition or instinct is natural for a lot of people today, but that's also because literacy is far higher today than it was in the ancient world, and recording things for posterity and for all kinds of other reasons is far more widespread and common than it was in the ancient world. So we would have no reason to expect any of Jesus's followers, probably very few of whom would have been literate to begin with, to see a need to write anything down, because it's all coming to an end anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so Casey just said, how convenient. And yeah, that is incredibly convenient. But I feel like that is at least where the evidence is lacking, because if, and where I partially agree with the original video that Dan's responding to, is that if there was a person, a figure of Jesus that at least gathered a following and pissed off the Romans to the point where they crucified him, I would think that that would at least be noticed. I mean, Josephus writes about like the Egyptian that gathered a number of people to try to overtake the Romans, and he failed, and he, fled off into the wilderness or whatnot. And there were I think a couple other failed messiahs at that time that he described. So even if he gathered a minimal amount of people, a force of Jews and Gentiles, I would think that, you would at least have some historians that were actually recording this person being there. And we just simply don't have any of that. And even Gesundheit, you're okay. As far as all that goes, even in Paul's writings, we don't have direct admission that Jesus was a historical person on earth. We only have the theological aspects of Jesus's teachings. We only have the celestial versions of everything that Paul understands about Jesus, because he clearly separates himself from any kind of historical sourcing by saying that he did not get his gospel from any person on earth. He only got it from a vision from Jesus and from the scriptures. So it was Paul using the scriptures, as well as getting or having hallucinations of this angel figure from Jewish angelology, that inspired him to, I guess, stop persecuting Christians and become a Christian himself, which he would have just understood as being a brother of the Lord.
Also, that time and that place is notorious for a lack of written sources. The overwhelming majority of our reconstructed history of 1st century CE, Judea and Galilee, comes from one or two historical sources. Folks like Josephus, folks like Philo, are responsible for the overwhelming majority of what we think we know happened in the 1st century CE in Judea, in Galilee. We don't really have much else. Now, we have a lot of material remains that we can correlate to these texts to try to see what can be corroborated, what can't. And so we can reconstruct a lot of the gaps that are left in the historical record, and we can even falsify some of the things that are in the historical record. But this time and this place is not well known for writing things down. In fact, we didn't even have any direct material evidence for the existence of Pontius Pilate the Roman who ruled in Judea during the time that Jesus was supposed to have had his ministry and been put to death, until we discovered a single inscription in the 1960s that mentions his name. So we don't have written records for pretty much every single person who lived in 1st century CE Judea and Galilee. And there were people who were a lot more famous than Jesus was during his life. Jesus became overwhelmingly most famous after his death, when traditions about his resurrection began to spread. So this is not really a compelling case to make against the historicity of a Jesus. Mostly this case just reveals that a lot of folks don't understand historiography, don't understand the accident of preservation, and don't understand the history of this time and place.
I would agree that the original video that Dan is responding to is ignoring like what we could conceivably have. And so just so that the the original video creator can have a reasonable sense of what to expect. So like, I'm not expecting like detailed like notes about Jesus, what he did and all this other stuff. I'm not expecting any of that. What I'm expecting is at least Paul or somebody like part of the Christian movement that references Jesus prior to his death. And we just don't get that in either Paul's letters or outside of Paul, like adjacent to Paul, like in Hebrews. Hebrews would be another group. It was either Paul's group or like somebody that's quite adjacent to Paul. But if either of those made any kind of reference to like a pre-crucifixion Jesus, I think that would be monumental in proving the mythicist theory wrong. But obviously if you would have one, you would expect to have more. But and the more that you have, the more you can be sure about Jesus being a historical figure. So like, that's what we should expect. We should expect people like Paul or Hebrews or other writings of that nature to at least mention a pre-crucified Jesus as opposed to the post-resurrection Christ.
Our earliest accounts of Jesus come from Paul.
So I don't think this is, strictly speaking, accurate.
Actually, it's very accurate. I mean, as far as our current knowledge base goes, Paul is the only written piece of evidence that we have. Now, would there have been oral lore before then, or oral stories or oral documentation, I guess, about Jesus? Sure. Is any of that preserved? We don't know. Like, we don't know what oral lore or oral information is preserved either in the Gospels or in Paul's work. There's no way for us to discern what is oral lore and what isn't. And that's a problem with the Gospels, because they don't identify what the sources were.
Our earliest accounts of Jesus come from the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew and then the Gospel of Luke.
Paul was written before the Gospels. And I mean, so there are accounts of Jesus in Paul. Like a lot of people like to cite Paul for the Last Supper, which it's actually the Lord's Supper technically, but they like to cite him for that, and they think that was like a real thing that happened that was told to Paul. But in actuality, that was Jesus revealing, the communal meal and how that is supposed to happen to Paul in his hallucination, rather than any kind of like human person informing him of a real historical event. But it's things like that are preserved in Paul that I would consider to be like an account of Jesus. Even if it's a celestial account of Jesus, it's still an account of Jesus. So I'm not exactly sure what specific determination that Dan is making here, or distinction that Dan is making here, but let's find out.
Our earliest references to Jesus come from Paul, but Paul doesn't really give any accounts of the historical Jesus, apart from a couple of oblique references to him being born of a woman, which...
Okay, so he's about to go on about being born of a woman, but it's very important to note there that the being born of a woman part, the born word is actually more indicative of being made. And Hebrews also does this with the same word, genomai. when you're wanting to be explicit about human birth, you would more likely use genao. And in fact, the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, in at least one place, if not another, the whole born of a woman thing was used there, and it uses genao. So Paul, being a very learned Jew and knowing the Septuagint, and admitting to scanning the Septuagint and the scriptures in general for information about Jesus, it seems like he would definitely know what the phrase was. So he made the conscious decision to change it from genao to genomai. And considering that he describes Jesus's body just like Adam's body was described, he uses genomai. And, God made Adam's body, and so God also made Jesus's body. I feel like that's a pretty logical conclusion to come to with that. And the fact that Paul only ever uses genomai for born of a woman as opposed to genao, which is more indicative of human birth, I feel like he made that decision very specifically. And do we know exactly what that decision was? No. But it seems to lean in the direction of admitting that Jesus was made. His body was made. He was given a fleshly body so that he could suffer and die, and then resurrect as a way to shed that sinful body and attain this perfect sinless body, right? And with that kind of theology in mind, that's how we get to this idea of it only happening celestially, because the celestial plane, like the firmament and everything above the firmament, that was the celestial plane. That's where the celestial figures resided. That's where Satan and his demons resided, as far as like where they fell to or whatnot. And so given that that's populated by very corporeal and fleshly beings, that's coincides with the idea that Paul considered Jesus to both be a flesh and blood human, but also not residing on earth and residing in the celestial sphere. So, I mean, there are explanations and there are ways that all of this stuff interconnects. You just have to widen your idea about these early Jewish Christians, put it more in a Jewish context rather than this post gospel, Christian context. I think that is probably what a lot of people mistake about interpreting Paul's work, because Paul is creating the Christian context there, right? He's creating that in his work. But the framework that he's using is very Jewish in nature, so we have to operate in that Jewish context. Part of that Jewish context is that there is a physical place, the firmament, where there are physical beings that reside that are made of flesh and blood, and Satan is among those creatures that inhabit that area. I mean, this is all explainable when you understand Jewish cosmology.
Is how most of us are born.
Paul famously never met Jesus in real life. He had a hallucination about him while he was on the road to Damascus, which resulted in his conversion to Christianity.
I gotta caution this guy right here on the screen. That's not how you want to represent that, because you're mixing up Paul's admittance to what he witnessed of Jesus, being the celestial visions and everything like that, versus the story written in Acts. The story written in Acts is mythical. We don't have any kind of indication that there was a road or Damascus or anything like that Paul received his vision on. That's a mythical construction by the author of Luke, right? So that is not a historical thing. I feel like maybe this original creator here that Dan's responding to is a little bit confused as to the interdependence on between these different books, and how the gospel, the things that are in the Gospels and the things that are in Acts are not necessarily historical, and we can't actually discern what is historical. But to mix up the claims that Paul makes in his epistles, the 6 official ones, to mix up those with these later fabrications of information, I feel like, I don't think that he's being disingenuous, but it's definitely wrong-headed to do.
But interestingly, in Galatians, he talks about going and meeting with Peter, whom biblical scholars assume to have been Simon Peter, the first pope. And yet, Paul doesn't record anything that Peter told him about Jesus.
Well, it's because, I mean, in Galatians 2, Paul does go back to Jerusalem to get information, not get information, but to convene with the other apostles. And they added nothing to his gospel. They added nothing to his information. So Paul did not get information from them about Jesus. They only affirmed what he was already teaching. So he didn't write about getting any information from them because they didn't. He didn't. He just his gospel was confirmed by the other apostles. Basically, in my view, he was basically comparing notes as to his interpretation of scripture and the hallucinations he's been getting with the other apostles that were getting similar hallucinations and understanding similar aspects of the scriptures. So they were apparently coinciding there.
You would think that there would be a mad rush to record everything that those apostles remembered about what Jesus said and did, what he was like when the crowds weren't around, all of the things that he told them. But none of that stuff ever got recorded.
Again, I think that this is wrong-headed to expect them to record those things because it was a very oral heavy movement and there were not a lot of educated people in it. So I think that, sort of gauging your expectation here, managing your expectations about what would be written down. So we're not expecting Paul to write down about every miracle that Jesus did before he was crucified or before he died. What we're expecting out of Paul's work, as well as other people that would be writing at that time, what we're expecting out of them is just some kind of reference to a pre-crucified Jesus. We don't need any specific story or anything like that. We just need a reference to a pre-crucified Jesus. And so that's putting the expectation fairly low on what to expect. They're reasonable expectations given the evidence that we do have. And when we search those particular sources like Hebrews and Paul's epistles, we just simply don't find any pre-crucifixion reference to Jesus. And so it's hard to make a case for him being a historical figure when it's only the celestial figure that's ever talked about in the earliest references that we have.
Paul shows absolutely no interest in that. Paul could not care less about what Jesus said or did on earth, which is extremely suspicious.
I mean, it may be suspicious for him not to mention Jesus on earth or anything that, Jesus taught while on earth. But I feel like that should just get you to see, get you to research deeper into it. And it definitely doesn't mean that Jesus didn't exist. Right. I think that that's a wrong way to go about it, but I definitely think that it should get you to reconsider all of the current evidence that we currently have for a historical Jesus, because it is quite suspicious that nobody writes any kind of pre-crucifixion details about Jesus. That definitely leaves the door open to him just being a mythological creation. And I think that we need to find evidence that actually shows that he was a historical figure as opposed to just being a mythical creation or a celestial figure rather, that starts in Jewish angelology, about a century prior.
So it's a wonderful observation that Paul doesn't seem to have recorded anything at all about the mortal life or ministry of the historical Jesus. But to call that suspicious is to betray a marked misunderstanding of what Paul was writing and why. Because when we look at Paul's writings, at least what has been preserved, and certainly there could be a lot that has not been preserved, but what has been preserved is all of the same basic genre. These are all paranetic texts. These are all letters that are intended to guide and instruct and give counsel and basically manage affairs in the congregations that Paul has set up around the northern Mediterranean. We don't have biography. We don't have history. We don't have poetry. We don't have all these other genres from Paul. And when we look in that one genre that we have from Paul, we see a marked concern for being ready for the imminent second coming and basically the end of the world. And Paul even says, a rule I set down in all my congregations is that you stay in the life circumstances you were in when you were called by God, because the time is short.
I get what Dan is saying here, but I feel like that's just commentary on how bad the evidence is for historical Jesus. So my question would be, why do we just automatically assume that Jesus was historical if the earliest references to this Jesus is not historical in any kind of way, and was never meant to be a historical accounting of Jesus or have any historical references to Jesus? I'm just kind of curious as to why we should continue in that assumption if it seems like there's just only this celestially revealed Jesus that exists in the earliest earliest references to him. But I'm genuinely curious, and I'm genuinely asking the question, if Dan happens to see this video at all. I'm genuinely asking here, like, why do we just assume that Jesus existed at this point? Why is that a good assumption to make? And I just can't think of a good reason.
If you have a job, don't leave that job. If you don't have a family, don't start a family. If you are enslaved, unless you can manage to get out of it, just stay enslaved. Paul is telling people Jesus is coming back too quickly for us to worry about big life changes. So his concern is not recording stuff for posterity. His concern is not literary in nature. It's paranetic, which means it's counseling, it's guiding, it's giving advice, it's managing affairs.
Well, there are obvious teachings of Jesus that even Paul relates, like with visions of Jesus, that would be essential to like the stuff that Dan is talking about here. So if Jesus actually did exist on earth and was historical, and that was important to Paul, then he would have mentioned it. I think all this does is highlight the fact that for Paul, the only version of a Christ figure that mattered was a celestial one, specifically a revelatory celestial one. And so as far as Paul goes, it doesn't matter if Jesus was a historical figure. The only thing that actually matters is the resurrected Christ. That's the only version of this figure that actually matters for Paul. And I mean, I'm not alone in this whole celestial like being sort of interpretation. Dr. Bart Ehrman, he's recently turned around on it. I believe in his maybe How Jesus Became God, I think is where he kind of talked about this. But like Paul definitely sees Jesus as a pre-existent angel figure in Jewish angelology. The difference between Bart Ehrman and minimal mythicists like myself is that we think that Jesus stopped descending from heaven at the firmament, whereas Dr. Ehrman, and I'm guessing Dan here, would think that he descended from the upper levels of heaven, took on this fleshly body, and went all the way down to earth. Now, that all the way down to earth part, I don't think that we actually have good references that suggest that it actually he went all the way down to earth. I think that he stopped at the firmament in the mythos of Paul's Christianity.
So Paul is using the resources he has for writing to manage affairs in the hopes that any day now Jesus would come back. So it's not suspicious that he never took the time to write down a history of the life of Jesus. It makes perfect sense in light of why he wrote what he did write. But there's more. When we look at Galatians, and he talks about visiting Jerusalem and seeing Peter for 15 days and seeing James as well, he's talking about 3 years after his road to Damascus event. And then he says...
Whoa. I feel like Dan is mixing up accounts here, because Paul never says that there was a road to Damascus. That occurs in Acts. And so the road to Damascus is an Acts thing, which is fabricated by the gospel, anonymous author of Luke. So like that's different. Like between Galatians 1 and Galatians 2, there were 14 years, but in Galatians 1 it doesn't talk about a Damascus event. So that's not something that happened. I'm wondering why if Dan does follow the data, then he should follow the data on the fact that the anonymous author of Luke also wrote Acts, obviously, but also that Acts is historical fiction. That seems to be the case. So I'm not sure why Dan thinks. Well, I mean, I know that Dan is still Mormon, and that's also why I kind of don't, recommend Dan's book or anything like that, because he still tithes to the Mormon Church. As far as the last thing that I heard, he does. So that's why I don't recommend his book. But maybe that's because of his Mormon background and the fact that he's still Mormon. Maybe he believes that about like the book of Acts, that it is a historical accounting or something like that. I'm not sure.
14 years after that, I went back to Jerusalem and talked to a bunch of folks, including Peter. So Galatians is not the text where he is reporting on his visit to Peter. Galatians is, again, a paranetic, managing affairs letter that is mentioning stuff that happened well over a decade before the writing of that letter. So we shouldn't really expect Paul to have said anything about pumping Peter for information about Jesus's ministry in this letter, because that's not the genre, but it's also coming at least 14 years after his visit to Peter.
I do want to echo what Dan is saying here. Like, we're not expecting Paul to like pump Peter for historical information about Jesus, because like I said before, I don't think that Paul was really concerned with historical information about Jesus, because the only version of the Christ is the revelatory resurrected Christ. That's the only one that actually matters in this situation, for Paul at least. And so we don't expect that. But what we might expect is some kind of passive reference to, or not passive, but passing reference to the fact that Peter and the other apostles were actually disciples and that, actually knew Jesus or something like that. Of course, that would be antithetical to Galatians 1:11 that says that, he didn't get his information for any man on earth, and therefore is, him somehow affirming like, oh yes, these people knew Jesus, would be disconnecting the other apostles from the power and authority of the revelatory Jesus, being that they got this information from a person on earth. So I think that it would be definitely antithetical to what Paul is saying, but if we were to expect anything out of this section, we would expect Paul to reference them as being disciples, or at least learning at the feet of Jesus or something like that, or knowing Jesus before he resurrected in some kind of way. I would think that that's what we would expect. We wouldn't expect some kind of like full historical accounting of his deeds, works, and like everybody that was in his bro group of 12. That's not what we would expect here. So I do agree with Dan that we wouldn't expect that, but I would think from a minimal mythicist perspective, you would expect some kind of passing reference to them knowing Jesus before he died.
And so if he did pump Peter for information about the historical Jesus, he could have very well shared that in person as he was setting up these congregations. He could have written that down somewhere else that was not preserved. But based on what has been preserved of Paul, we shouldn't really expect that to be the case, because all that Paul is preserving is these letters that are managing affairs in these different congregations. And that's not conducive to the original sharing of historical narratives. That's not where that kind of thing goes on. That kind of thing usually goes on in the establishing of those congregations. So when we look at the actual contents of Paul's letters, when we look at the genre Paul was writing, when we look at how Paul represents his own worldview, it's not suspicious. It actually makes perfectly fine sense. It's not what we would like, but it makes sense of why Paul was writing what he did write that happens to have been preserved down to us.
It's at this point that biblical scholars and historians will stand up and say, nobody just makes stuff up. Nobody just invents a God and starts to believe in it.
I don't know any biblical scholars or historians who say that people don't just make up gods. People do, but when they make up gods, it tends to follow certain patterns. And
right. And the pattern in this particular case is in line with Jewish with Jewish theology, and especially the angelology of Judaism, but also syncretizes that theology of Judaism with the mystery cults that were going around, and the general structure of the mystery cults and what was being taught about the mystery cults. We have evidence of that in Philo of Alexandria, where he talks about the use of Pesherim in order to reveal information about the logos of God, which goes by many names, but is the angel of God that is later identified by Paul as being the Son of God or Jesus Christ. And so, yeah. I do want to do a little bit of a clarification, because Examusic in the comments said that Paul's letters do mention Damascus and 3 years later going to Jerusalem, but doesn't mention the Jesus experience in that passage. What I meant was the road to Damascus story in and of itself is not historical, because that's contained in Acts. And so I'm not sure if Damascus was where he had whatever kind of revelatory thing or whatnot. And I'm not sure where that's actually mentioned. Let's see. Let's see. Acts. Paul's perspective. No. Galatians 17-18. Paul mentions he went to Arabia and later returned to Damascus, where he does not give details on the conversion itself. Yeah. So he went into Arabia and then later returned to Damascus. So there's no indication as to what caused his conversion or whatnot. So I guess I guess my problem with Dan was the road, mentioning the road to Damascus, because I feel like that is claiming more information than we have.
And it tends to occur in a certain way that doesn't really fit with what we have with the tradition of Jesus. A far more likely explanation when it comes to how the data got to be the way they are in regards to the tradition of Jesus is that these divine events and attributions and features accreted to the tradition of an actual historical figure.
Yeah, but Dan, you're just saying that. You're just saying that he's a historical figure. You're not actually providing any kind of real argumentation that he was a historical figure. And what makes it more likely? I mean, I feel like the minimum ethicist position is far likelier than a human person being at the center of it, primarily because the very beginnings of Christianity was a mystery cult. And part of the basic mystery cult structure was that they had a savior that was mythological in nature from the very beginning. And we also have Philo of Alexandria, as well as Paul, identifying this logos, or the Christ figure, in Paul's case, the logos in Philo's case, as being an angel that already exists celestially. So why is it just automatically assumed that he was a historical figure? I don't see any reason to automatically assume those things. I think that we would need some kind of justification for assuming that kind of thing, because just like Dan said, there aren't scholars that say that people don't just make up gods, but they're not making up Jesus in this respect. They are revealing Jesus from the existing Jewish theology, and this savior figure that Judaism has preached since the post-exilic era, that should be coming to free and rescue the Jewish people. This is something that's been a long time in the making by the time the first century hits. So it's had plenty of time to cook and marinate and all the marinate and then cook and all this other kind of shit. And so by the time we get to the first century, there's already people that have fully formed theologies for this celestial angel figure that's supposed to save them. So, I mean, I guess I just don't understand, like, what's that extra ingredient that makes it more likely, that makes it more parsimonious to just assume that Jesus existed as a historical figure rather than him being a mythological construction out of existing Jewish lore.
But people have always done exactly that. Serapis is a fantastic example. Serapis was a combination of Osiris and Zeus that was literally invented by the Greeks who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great conquered it. They one day just said, here's a new god, everybody. And people said, okay. And they started worshiping it.
Okay. I just want to complain a little bit here about this guy, because I think that bringing up Serapis right here, while it's apt to like just creating a god, which Dan has already said, sure, people made up gods. But he tried to draw a distinction between that and Christianity. What I think that would be a better way of doing that is appealing to Zoroastrianism, Mithraism, or the Isis and Osiris cult, or any of the other mystery cults that were going around at the time that had mythological figures at their center and that built a following around these mythological figures. I think that it makes the point more succinctly and provides an actual archetypal sort of framework to build the mythology of Jesus off of. I think that would strike at the point better. It would have better support, and you wouldn't have so much pushback by mentioning fucking Serapis.
So some concerns with this representation of where Serapis came from. That's absolutely not what happened. Ptolemy the First Soter did not just say, boom, we got a new deity, this is Osiris and Zeus. Serapis, the name, comes from Osiris Apis, which is a hybrid deity with Osiris and then Apis, two deities that were associated with the underworld. And that hybrid deity had been worshipped in Memphis long before Alexander the Great came by. So all the Ptolemaic dynasty did was slap a name on this deity and then say, ooh, we don't like your animal-based imagery. We're going to overlay this pre-existing hybrid deity with iconography and features and things like that associated with a bunch of our other favorite deities, like Zeus and like other deities. So it's really just a rebranding of a hybrid deity that already existed. So this is not like what happened with Jesus.
Well, I mean, I feel like it's somewhat similar to what happened with Jesus, because Jesus is a product of syncretism between the mystery cults and their teachings around that were very common to mystery cults and Judaism. And Judaism already had an angel figure, the Logos, that Philo identified and then later Paul identified as being the Christ. Both of them, identified this person and syncretized these Hellenistic ideas with Judaism. And so the Osiris and Apis that Dan was just talking about there, which I haven't actually verified it. I'm willing to take Dan at his word here because I don't really care about that particular aspect of it. But if that is the case, then it seems like Osiris and Apis were syncretized together to form this hybrid deity, and that's how it's formed. Now it doesn't come like, oh, one person went snap and boom, there's a new god and people are worshiping him. Obviously that's not what happened, but there is a syncretism happening there, and I think that the exact same thing happened with the Christ figure of Judaism, this savior figure of Judaism getting molded into the Jesus Christ that Paul understands.
Now, some people will say, well, Jesus was just a rebranding or hybridization of a bunch of different deities. And that's just not supported by the data. I've covered that in numerous videos. All of your zeitgeisty claims about how everybody was born of a virgin on December 25th are just made up.
I totally agree about that. Like, you don't know how much I cringe and facepalm whenever I see that fucking meme go around every Christmas time that compares Jesus to all these other figures as having like 12 disciples born on December 24th, also had their dicks cut. Like, that's so tiring, and it's not accurate. I think that if you're going to be comparing Jesus to these other deities and as far as being inspirational or that he's following some kind of pattern, you need to compare him to these other mystery cult deities like Isis and Osiris, like Zoroastrianism, Mithra and Mithraism. Like, there are aspects of each of those that are integrated into Christianity that distinguishes it from Judaism and makes it a mystery cult. Those are far better examples, even though they're not as, I guess, sexy as like just listing out the same shit for each one of them. But it would at least be fucking accurate.
None of that is accurate. All of it is just made up. Serapis is not a good analog to Jesus, not only because Serapis is just a Greco-Roman rebranding of an existing Egyptian deity, but also you have a ruler imposing this new deity on a population, which is entirely distinct from a bottom-up grassroots following. You can establish a cult and a deity if you rule the nation. It's a lot different to try to establish and spread the worship of a brand new deity you just made up when it's women and enslaved people who are running this grassroots movement. So these are not analogous deities, and this is not a good argument. This is a conclusion in search of an argument.
I'm just kind of curious. I'm pausing right here, not necessarily to respond to anything Dan is saying, because I agree with his frustration in this particular section here. But I'm just kind of curious why Dan, and this is just from what I've seen of Dan's content surrounding mythicism and branding mythicism in a certain light. Why does Dan only take the worst mythicist claims, the ones that are so far off from any kind of scholarly basis? Why does he represent those as being mythicists? Now, it's not that I disagree that they are mythicists, because that's what they are. They are portraying that sort of view, I guess, but they're definitely not scholarly supported. Now, my minimal mythicist position is scholarly supported twice over. 2 peer-reviewed monographs. Richard Carey's on the historicity of Jesus, and then you've got Raphael Lataster's questioning the historicity of Jesus. Both of those have been put through peer review. Lataster's book has been put through Brill, which is one of the most prestigious scholarly publishers out there. And then Carrier actually has a second book that has gotten through peer review yet again about this same topic. And so, oh yes, Proving History was also peer-reviewed. Even though it didn't necessarily focus on the historicity of Jesus, it definitely laid the groundwork for the correct methodology for analyzing history, which I think is invaluable in general. And so I'm just kind of curious, and maybe Dan, if he ever watches this, can answer this for me, but why pick the worst mythicist representations out there to respond to and represent them and represent mythicism as just sort of like a monolithic position? I mean, I try not to represent all historicists in the same light, because there are definitely historicists that think that like the Gospels are historically accurate, which that's not true. And then there are more minimal historicists that try to take a more reserved approach to the historical Jesus. And so like I try to distinguish between those two. I just don't know why people, and Dan included, would want to represent the worst of the bunch as being the monolithic representation of the entire group. Because everything that the guy is saying is in the video is either not presented accurately, or is actually points that even me as a mythicist would disagree with. It seems rather odd.
This is a dogma that is trying to find a rationalization and is having to misrepresent what goes on in the ancient world with the developments of divine profiles and worshipers and followings.
That's what people have always done. How do you think the Heaven's Gate cult thing happened? People just made up the stories and then other people believed in them. It's not that complicated.
Heaven's Gate was started by 2 Christians who decided that they were the two witnesses from the book of Revelation. And then they incorporated features of a UFO cult. And so it was really just taking a pre-existing tradition and slapping some new agey iconography and features and things like that onto it. And then from there, they accreted other new details to their narrative of how the end of the world is going to happen.
I'm sorry, but how is that different than Christianity started? Because like I said, Christianity is a syncretization between Judaism and Hellenistic ideas and mystery cults. And so what Dan is explaining here is the exact same process that Judaism went through in order for Christianity to become a thing. And the thing with, if you wanted to identify it in a similar fashion or talk about it in a similar fashion, the Heaven's Gate cult was a syncretization between Christianity and the UFO culture that was going around, that still exists today. But both the Heaven's Gate cult still exists today and UFO culture exists today. So that it was just another syncretization of one religion with another, cult-like group. And they developed new interpretations. They developed new information for their cult and everything like that. How is that different? And honestly, Dan should recognize the same thing for Mormonism. Mormonism is a syncretization of Christianity with, I guess maybe bullshit. I really don't know what you could say. It's a syncretization between bullshit and Christianity. But I mean, very obviously, Mormonism is a bullshit religion. But it was born out of Christianity, and it was syncretized with some other idea to create a whole new version of the faith. So this has happened over and over and over again. Heaven's Gate cult is a syncretization, just of a UFO cult group and Christianity, which could be identified as a mystery cult group. So it's just another changing of it. I mean, and again, Mormonism is no different. Jehovah's Witnesses, no different in that kind of respect. So, I mean, I don't understand why he's pushing back against this. I mean, I understand the vast differences between the two, but the process that he just described is the exact process that I described earlier. Just it was between Hellenistic cults and Judaism. That's it.
That is also not analogous to what we have with the rise of followers of Jesus. But again, even if we do,
I disagree with that. So you've got the people that syncretized Christianity with the UFO culture, and that drew in people both from Christianity and the UFO culture. It resonated with them. They were able to put together a theology that made sense to some people. I don't understand why Dan is pushing back against this idea and saying that it doesn't connect. Like, that seems quite illogical to me. Am I misreading this, honey? Like, do you think that like it just seems weird for him to be like, these are totally different things when they're really the exact same fucking thing? Yeah. Okay. You're usually my barometer for whether or not I'm being ridiculous. Okay.
Relates the accretion of these divine features to Jesus to the way that other divine figures have come about. That is the posthumous Christ tradition that we're talking about. It has no relationship to the historical Jesus that we reconstruct based on the available data. Even if we do acknowledge that the way that Jesus became divine and became worshipped as a god is analogous to the way other individuals have become divinized and worshipped as gods, and there are many ways that that is true, that doesn't bear on whether or not that tradition developed from a historical Jesus who was not divine and who was executed by the Romans because he caused a riot in the temple on Passover.
You see, I'm still kind of curious as to why seems to be arbitrarily picking out these different aspects of Jesus's life and claiming that that is what got him executed. despite the fact that we don't have any evidence that he was executed by the Romans, we don't have Paul who says that the Romans executed him. In fact, Paul says that the archons of this aeon are the ones that executed him. And normally how apologists will get around that is that they'll say, oh, well, either Satan, who is the real enemy of God and of Christians at this time, Satan worked through the Romans in order to do it. So that's why, the Paul references them like that. And so he's really referencing the Romans when he says archons of this aeon. Or they just flat out claim that the archons of this aeon would be the Romans, even though the same kind of language is used by Paul to describe Satan and his demons as the principality and powers. Those were the real, enemies of God. They didn't give a fuck about the Romans. They didn't care about, because the Romans were earthly shit. And it just like Dan just described, Paul wasn't concerned about earthly shit because all that earthly shit was going away soon. When Dan was talking about earlier about how Paul was like, oh, don't get out of your job. Don't do anything because the end is coming soon. If you're enslaved, stay enslaved because the end is coming soon and you're going to be like with God in heaven and all this other kind of bullshit that Christianity teaches. So like, if that was the focus of Paul, why would then Paul blame the Romans for killing Jesus, calling them the archons of this aeon and presenting them as this, this evil force against Christians? Why would he do that? And the answer is he wouldn't. He would consider Satan and the demons to be the archons of this aeon because that's what he calls them. Sorry, I'm just a little agitated by Dan's mixing up of shit and arbitrarily cherry picking out of the Gospels certain facts he wants to be historical.
So we have to keep these things separate. And there are almost no scholars of relevant disciplines who would say the best explanation for how the tradition got to be the way that it is in the data that are preserved down to us is that somebody just made it all up.
Well, no, it wouldn't be that somebody made it all up. It's a reinterpretation of existing Jewish theology that gets transformed into this celestially revealed Messiah that is to accomplish the things that Judaism claims the Savior is going to accomplish and save people, save the Jewish people, the remnant. So it would not be like a made up thing. It would be a reinterpretation of existing ideas. Which is exactly what he's been describing about the Heaven's Gate cult, and it's the exact same thing about Mormonism, which may be the blind spot that prevents him from actually seeing that happening with Christianity, is that he's a bit blinded by Mormonism to see how Judaism was reinterpreted to be Christianity. I don't know.
That is not a good way to account for how the data got to be the way they are. It's certainly not the most likely explanation.
At this point, fundamentalists will usually say something like, Jesus is more well attested than Socrates, but this is also not true.
Yeah, that's a nonsensical argument. And
I'm so happy to fucking hear Dan McClellan say that, because that's awesome to hear from him, that it's a nonsensical argument to claim that, the evidence for Jesus is better than Socrates and all this other stuff. I don't know what he's about to say next, but I'm ecstatic to hear that from Dan.
And I have long criticized the misinformation that is spread by folks who want to try to appeal to the thousands and thousands of manuscripts that overwhelmingly come from almost 1,000 years after the composition of the text of the New Testament. I'm going to skip over this because it's irrelevant.
And Socrates is actually unusually well documented for somebody from his era that never wrote a book and never conquered a country.
So I do want to dip back in here to note that this content creator can acknowledge the differences in the strength of attestation for different figures based on time and place, which means you should be able to acknowledge that we have virtually no attestation for almost everyone who lived in 1st century CE Judea and Galilee, irrespective of what they managed to achieve in their lives.
Well, right, but as far as minimal mythicism goes, we're not expecting that kind of evidence. We're not expecting there to be evidence where we shouldn't expect there to be evidence. But where we expect evidence to poke its head out is in the writings of Paul and in the like in Hebrews, in those kinds of already available things, and also in histories that were being written at that time that would have mentioned this Jesus figure, like Josephus's works or other histories that could mention tangential things to the Christ figure. If he were actually real. So we're only looking for evidence where evidence should be, and we're not expecting evidence, that shouldn't already be there. That's where I feel like the miscommunication is going on with Dan here is that, he thinks that we're asking for evidence that just shouldn't exist for an itinerant rabbi going around. I think that looking for evidence where none exists is a bit nonsensical, to use a Dan word.
There's not a lot of historical attestation for this time and place. It's really Josephus, some Philo, some other scattered references that document the history of this time and place. So the fact that someone who never wrote anything, probably had a small following, caused a riot in the temple over Passover, and then was executed for his troubles, the fact that we don't have any first-hand historical accounts of that figure is no surprise whatsoever.
Right. It's no surprise, but that also means that we shouldn't assume. You notice how specific he's getting here, that he was a figure that gathered a following and then overturned tables in a temple and got executed. Like, that's a very specific sequence of events that is obviously inspired by the gospel accounts. But, if we don't have information to make those specific claims, why are we making those specific claims? We don't have evidence that actually says that those things are historical events. And maybe he is fine arbitrarily stating that, like, this is the most logical sequence of events that would have happened if he were a historical figure, which seems to placate his Mormon sensibilities. Like, I guess I can understand that. But at the same time, if he's working from the data, why is he inventing data that we don't have evidence to support in order to justify his conclusion? And that's what I find is the difference between apologetics and New Testament scholarship, at least good scholarship, is that you invent information. And if you're ad hoc asserting that these things existed, and then you're going to then invent sources behind them in order to support them, that is apologetics. You're doing apologetics at that point. And I feel like Dan engages in apologetics for specifically, mostly this topic. And I find that that's true of most historicists, is that they revert to their apologetic background whenever it comes to these more difficult questions about what is historical about Jesus and what evidence do we have for the historical Jesus. As Dan said, we literally have barely anything about the historical Jesus, and we shouldn't expect much out of this historical Jesus. But there are, writers like Paul, like the author of Hebrews, and other things like that. But I feel like Dan has to overcome the mystery cult nature of Christianity, of the earliest accountings of Christianity, which would come from Paul. He has to overcome the mystery cult nature of it in order to posit that this was the one mystery cult that had a real historical figure. And so far, I don't see the evidence that's being presented in order to justify that conclusion, that Christianity was the one mystery cult that had a real savior figure at the beginning of it, and that's how it built its following. All the other mystery cults did not have a real savior figure. They did not have any kind of historical nature to their stories, and they all gained followings, and they all had followers that persisted after the supposed death of their savior. So I distinguish Christianity from the other mystery cults for me.
Now, the fact that in the decades and centuries following his death, a huge following accreted to that tradition, and he developed divine characteristics and became worshipped as the very God of the universe doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not that historical figure existed.
Somebody subscribed. I agree that taking on the literal aspects of the previous of the gospel versions of Jesus, I don't think that that's where you should be focused. I think that you should be focused on a minimal historical Jesus, like Dan has been purporting here. That's why I'm asking for the evidence that supports his claims of, like, you know, he existed, he gathered a following, he made a disturbance at a temple, and then he was crucified by Romans. Those are very specific claims that, you know, if those are actually historical events that happened around Jesus, we should have evidence for those things. But we don't have Paul attesting that the Romans killed Jesus. We don't have Paul attesting that Jesus was even, crucified by the Romans. And we don't have Paul that attests to the temple being overturned by Jesus. That's actually a gospel thing. So, like, we don't have any evidence to suggest that these things are real historical facts. So why should we automatically assume that they are? It just seems like you're inventing data instead of reacting to the data that we have.
That is an entirely separate consideration.
Personally, I would expect somebody who was as supposedly famous as Jesus was to be much more well documented.
But what if he was not as famous and as divine as the gospel accounts that were written decades after his death?
Now, I totally agree with Dan here that the original creator is, I guess, expecting way too much out of the situation that Christianity developed from, right? I wouldn't expect more documentation than we already have for it, right? But I would expect out of the documentation that we have, clear references to a pre-crucified Jesus. That's what I would expect. I'm not going as far as to say that, you know, there was any one event that caused his crucifixion or anything like that. It would suffice to me to have like a pre-Christian Jesus that was, or not pre-Christian, but pre-crucifixion Jesus that was attested to, because then Paul would mention the cross or his crucifixion later, and it would just suffice that he was crucified for one reason or another. I really don't care what the reason is. It's the fact that Paul doesn't mention a pre-crucified Jesus that is the problem, and I don't think that that's asking too much or expecting too much out of the material. I think that that is expecting what we should expect within the material.
Imagined he was. What if he was just an itinerant apocalyptic Jewish preacher who caused a riot in the temple over Passover and was crucified for his troubles?
My question is, I get that he caused like a disturbance in the temple, in the Jewish temple and everything like that, but why would that prompt the Romans to crucify him? Maybe Dan can square that idea with me. Like, what causes the Romans to care about a Jew disrupting the Jewish temple services or the Jewish temple market or whatever? Why would that matter to the Romans necessarily? Because I don't know if Dan would agree that he was calling for, like, he was some kind of rebellious type of Jew that was calling for the overturning of the Romans rule or something like that. Is that, I wonder if that's what Dan claims, or is it something else? I'm very confused by the, fucking up a Jewish temple to Roman crucifixion. I don't understand that.
We're still presupposing that the gospel accounts are what we should find in the historical record, and that's just not the case. And so when we impose all of these demands on the Christ of the Gospels and say we don't find that in the historical record, we're not looking for the historical Jesus. We're looking for the Christ of the Gospels. Let's look for the historical Jesus.
I mean, Paul was operating within the Christian church only a few years after Jesus supposedly died, and yet he never recorded anything about the man that anybody told him, even though he supposedly knew the apostles that worked closely with Jesus during his lifetime.
That's a little, that's misleading. Paul never references the apostles as knowing Jesus during Jesus's lifetime, pre-crucifixion. Paul never mentions that they did those things. It's a later gospel tradition that those were the disciples of Jesus. So this is a bit wrong-headed here because you're again mixing up like gospel shit with pre-gospel shit, and you shouldn't do that. If Paul doesn't identify them as being disciples or knowing Jesus while he was alive, then you can't sit there and say that that is a historical fact that Paul knew them as disciples. That would be an assumption. That would be inventing data.
That just doesn't add up.
Well, it adds up just fine if you allow Paul to operate on his own terms.
It makes perfect sense as long as you're fine making up bullshit. Because that's what it like saying that the people that Paul met, Peter, John, James, they were disciples of Jesus. That would be made up information. And I guess like I don't know how Dan does math, but you definitely don't do math by inventing numbers and then putting those numbers in there and you get like a solution. Like I can't think of a time where you would necessarily do that because there's like an order of operations in math. I could go off on math right there, but the point of fact is that you just don't make shit up in order to make the equation work out. You have to work with the information that's presented in front of you. And if you just make shit up, then you're not doing it right.
And to be this apocalyptic philosopher preacher who is managing affairs in the congregations that he has set up around the northern Mediterranean in anticipation of the imminent second coming of Jesus. If we demand that he have this archivist intuition and instinct that so many of us have today, then it doesn't make much sense. But that's not who Paul was. That's not his history. If we allow him to operate on his own terms, it makes perfect sense. But that requires that we gain quite a bit of understanding of what's going on in the letters of Paul and what's going on with Paul and his life and the congregations that he has set up. That requires a lot of discipline, a lot of critical thinking. And the fit for this video has been Wolverine.
Thank you, Dan, for the Wolverine, and it's staying on screen there as him lifting up his shirt. Yeah, that was a pretty quick outro there. But yeah, no, I mean, I guess I don't have any problems necessarily with his last little sentiment there. But it's very obvious that Dan, hold on, let me get back to the main camera here. It's very obvious, I feel, that Dan is working within a paradigm that is very specific to his Mormon background, in that he can't see the syncretization between Judaism and Hellenistic and mystery cult culture. And he definitely can't see that, due to how he characterized the Heaven's Gate cult, because that was just a syncretization between the UFO culture and Christianity. And in much the same way, Judaism was syncretized with Hellenistic and mystery cult culture in order to create Christianity. And so, like, we've got examples of that. Philo of Alexandria is an example of the syncretization happening. He was busy syncretizing Hellenistic culture with Judaism, and then Paul also was doing the exact same thing. So, I mean, we have direct examples of that. We're also not looking for data where it shouldn't be. And we're obviously not looking for data that doesn't exist. And we're not saying that Jesus doesn't exist because we lack that data. We're looking at the data that we do have, and we're analyzing it to determine whether or not the most likely conclusion is that Jesus existed. Considering that the mystery cult figures, none of them actually existed, like outside of Christianity. The other mystery cult people, saviors, they never existed. So there's no reason to think that Jesus was the super special one that definitely did exist. At least that's where my head is at. There's also the whole rank Raglan mythotype that is prominent. I mean, obviously, just because you meet the criteria for the rank Raglan mythotype doesn't necessarily mean that you're ahistorical. But if you score pretty high on it, then you're more than likely going to be not historical. And that's even if you factor in high ranking individuals that do that do match at that high ranking. It seems much more likely that that figure is going to be ahistorical than he is to be historical. And so I feel like, you know, minimal historicists, they have a lot to overcome with those aspects in general. And until they actually overcome those, it's just not going to be convincing. It's still going to be inventing information. It's going to be inventing data in order to make shit work. And I just can't see myself being convinced by invented data. Who would want to do that? Who would want to be convinced of a position after data that has been just made up either by you or by somebody else? That's not convincing to me. And I'd really love to hear some kind of explanation. But I probably won't get it, which is fine. I don't care. I'm a measly person here on YouTube, just making, you know, shit content. So that's going to be it for me today. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I so appreciate everybody contributing to the super chats that allowed us to take a look at Dan McClellan's video, as well as the Columbus Day video that was at the very beginning of the show. And yeah, I guess I will just see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good shit. Bye, heathens.